When a Florida apartment catches fire, first responders make a tragic discovery inside.
She has significant burn marks over her torso.
I mean, it was heartbreaking.
But it's soon clear this was no ordinary fire.
The face of the smoke detectors have been removed.
This was a cover-up for murder.
Someone intentionally did this.
The investigation reveals a tumultuous relationship ready to explode.
He had threatened Kayla in the past.
There's a love triangle going on here.
I said, man, we still can mess around. I don't care as long as I get me.
It's getting messier and messier.
She didn't think that it would get this far. She thought she had it under control.
However, just as the investigation closes in on a killer,
now you going down, baby. They got evidence on your behind.
one small mistake could cause their case to go up in smoke.
They have the whole story, and sometimes they just slip up.
He was out boasting and bragging. They let me go, I'm free, I'm free.
It's an unbelievable feeling. I mean, it was so bad.
November 15, 2013, Homestead, Florida. Despite being the middle of autumn, it's a warm Friday night on the outskirts of sparkling Miami.
Homestead is in Miami-Dade County. It's about 30 miles south of the city center of Miami.
Homestead is more suburban. It's more strip malls and other things like that instead of the big high-rises and condos and clubs and fancy hotels that you're gonna find on South Beach.
But at 9 p.m., Miami-Dade Fire and Rescue are in a race against time.
Miami-Dade Rescue 911 received a number of calls about a fire in an apartment complex in Homestead, Florida.
Miami-Dade County Police and Fire, what is your emergency?
We're on fire, please send us up right away.
What's on fire?
It's one of the apartments, it's the third floor.
When the authorities arrive on scene, officers evacuate the remaining tenants, while firefighters prepare to extinguish the blaze.
Fortunately, a sprinkler system inside the unit has worked to put out most of the fire, and they're able to put out whatever remnants of the fire remain.
Amidst the chaos, they learn the apartment belongs to a 22-year-old woman named Kayla Gloucester.
I received a call from the apartment management that the apartment was on fire. Immediately, I hung up the phone and I called Kayla. I called and I called and I called and she didn't answer.
I was calling her phone trying to see where she at. I thought she had done jumped in the car with somebody and went and left a pot on the stove.
However, when firefighters enter the apartment, they make a tragic discovery.
Kayla Gloucester is lying on the floor. Her body is burned.
She didn't even have a chance. Kayla is dead.
22-year-old Kayla Gloucester had a vibrant personality that set her apart from the crowd.
She was a firecracker. I mean, she was loving, but a little bit feisty.
Kayla did not hold back. She was very blunt. She always told the truth, whether you liked it or not.
But when you get to know her, she's very funny. She was fun to be around. She was a jokester.
Everyone just gravitated towards her. She was very outgoing, free-spirited.
We were those girls. We were popular, we were pretty. So yeah, we actually took full advantage of that.
As a true Miami-Dade native, Kayla also had a keen eye for fashion.
She was passionate about designer wear.
She was a fashionista. She would get her nails like Hello Kitty. And if her closet was open, I'm going shopping.
However, Kayla's favorite activity was spending time with her family.
She loves family gatherings. That was her passion. And we would always have outings. Every weekend, we were probably doing something as a family.
She was so soft-hearted. She was my protector. She was my first best friend.
But in one moment, Kayla's family changed forever.
On January 23, 2009, Kayla's older brother, Derek, was killed in a shooting.
He just was going to meet his buddy, and they was going to go somewhere else. Then that's when all hell broke loose.
He was in the wrong place at the wrong time. I don't think that was for him. That was not his time.
It was the first traumatic death in our family that we have ever experienced. So it did kind of knock us off our feet.
The guy that did it, Little Bill, he confessed to it. And they gave him a pass on it because he was cooperating on other murder cases. They only gave him 25 years. And that's all he got.
In the wake of her brother's murder, Kayla became even more driven.
She wanted to go on to be a correction officer, but after she finished school, she had to work at these jobs here and there.
Kayla worked at the car wash and Pizza Hut.
Eventually, Kayla saved up enough funds to afford her first apartment.
They had a gate, you had to go inside the gate and stuff. It was a nice, quiet area. It was really nice.
Kayla had also started dating someone new, 32-year-old Robert Holton.
Kayla was walking through the neighborhood one day, and Robert rode up on her and hey, how you doing?
Robert was, he's a bigger guy. He was a football coach. He worked construction and other jobs.
He was a single dad, and he had full custody of his son.
Robert may have been 10 years older than Kayla, but they seemed like kindred spirits.
She liked the fact that he was older. She felt like he was someone who could protect her.
It was nice because he treated her very well, very gentle with her. He would give her whatever she wanted. And if she ever come to him with a request, he was able to provide it for her.
But now, Kayla Gloucester has been found dead in her South Miami apartment after it went up in flames. And a closer look of the scene reveals signs of foul play.
When looking at the smoke detectors, what they realize is that the face of the detectors have been removed.
Even more chilling, the burns aren't Kayla's only injuries.
Kayla has also been stabbed in the throat.
Maybe this wasn't an accidental fire. Maybe this was a cover-up for murder.
On November 15th, 2013, Miami-Dade firefighters have just found 22-year-old Kayla Gloucester deceased inside her apartment.
She has significant burn marks over her torso.
And it's soon clear Kayla's tragic death was no accident.
The face of the smoke detectors have been removed.
Kayla has also been stabbed in the throat.
They now have homicide on their hands.
As Kayla's family members arrive on scene, they're hoping for good news.
We didn't know what had happened. We just knew the apartment was on fire, and that was it.
But their hopes are soon crushed.
Next thing you know, I see 4 cars pull up. I see the badges, and it got homicide. That's when he told me they found her dead.
I was broken. I was broken. To endure another loss of losing a child, that's a pain is unexplainable. Yet to lose one, then to lose another one.
I mean, we cried together. I mean, it was heartbreaking. It was heartbreaking.
I was miles away when my dad called me. That moment was very shattering, and it was the second tragic event that has occurred in my life.
Inside the apartment, homicide detectives get to work processing the crime scene.
What they discovered was blood in several locations. There was blood on the bedroom door frame and the closet.
There's blood in the bathroom. There's blood by the toilet. There's blood on the bathtub area.
Investigators surmise that whatever happened to Kayla, she put up a fight.
They noticed that she has deep cuts to her hands.
The girl was in there getting it down. She did not make it easy. Her wounds and her injuries, it conveyed that.
Following the trail of evidence, detectives uncover multiple signs of arson attempts.
The mattress looks like it was set on fire. There's a portion of the carpet that looks like it had been set on fire. They also noticed a bottle of motor oil in the kitchen area. And they believe that this is what the individual had used to set the fire.
Someone intentionally did this. It appears that the killer may have stabbed her first and then set her body on fire to try to destroy evidence.
The sprinkler, it heat up and it burst, and it still set off the fire alarm.
It did not appear that any of her property had been taken. So they ruled out the possibility of this was someone who came to steal and burglarize.
There does not seem to be any signs of forced entry.
This was someone that Kayla knew and felt safe enough with to let them into her space.
In their search for suspects, detectives turn to Kayla's devastated parents. Do they have any idea who could have done this to her?
She was not troublemaker in the sense where she would just attract that type of energy from anyone.
But Kayla's parents say there is one person who's been causing trouble in Kayla's life.
That person was Robert Holton.
Their relationship was tumultuous. They would be on again, they would be off again.
There was red flags. He did start being mean. He did start being nasty towards her.
They say he had threatened Kayla in the past.
In April of 2013, Kayla called me. She said, "Dad, Robert over here busting my windows out of my car, and he's beating at my door with a crowbar."
Kayla's dad immediately raced over there to intervene.
Where is he?
I don't know. He left.
When I got there, all her windows was busted out. Robert wasn't there. He wasn't on the premises. He was gone. So I gave her my phone. I said, "Call him." He answered my number. I asked him, "Hey, why you did what you did with Kayla windows?" And he wouldn't say nothing.
Answer me.
Kayla's father says he wasn't letting Robert off easy.
I say, "Do not play with that." I say, "I don't take that lightly. You're gonna fix those windows on that car." And I told him where the car was gonna be at, what shop I was taking it to, and whatever he did, when I went to go pick the car up, it was paid for.
Kayla's father says she eventually decided to end things with Robert for good, and even started dating someone else.
She'd recently moved on with a young man named Cedric.
He was coming, visiting Kayla at least 2 to 3 nights out of the week. So he was getting ready to move in full time with Kayla.
He definitely promised me that, he'll take care of her.
Did that set Robert off?
Love makes some people go crazy.
Miami-Dade detectives investigating the murder of 22-year-old Kayla Gloucester have just learned that she'd recently ended things with her on and off boyfriend, Robert Holton, and moved on with a young man named Cedric.
He was just a little bit older than us. Took care of his family, took care of everyone around him.
Just then, Cedric arrives at the crime scene, shocked by the tragic news.
I actually liked him for Kayla. I mean, it was nothing but respect and love. I mean, he got my number, I got his number.
He was actually, I feel like, the love of her life, almost.
Now, detectives wonder if Robert was so jealous of Kayla's new relationship with Cedric that it motivated him to kill her.
They want to speak to Robert Holton, ASAP.
He agreed to speak with them.
After the sun comes up over Miami-Dade County, detectives sit down with Robert inside an interrogation room. Robert wastes no time claiming his innocence.
Kayla, my son, they was like close and hurt me right now. And I'm in question for something I didn't do.
He says that she's someone that he loves and cares about and that he wouldn't want to see anything bad happen to her.
His story isn't really matching up with what they've learned from Kayla's family. According to Robert, he and Kayla were still very much together.
How long had you been going with Kayla at this time?
But now, man, like off and on, like 1.5 years.
He admits that there's some problems in the relationship, but says he would never hurt her.
Like, we used to get into little fights and stuff like that, but it wasn't really not serious.
Were you in love with Kayla?
Yeah, that was my ace.
Robert says he'd even spent time with Kayla at her apartment earlier that day.
So she asked me what I'm gonna come through. I'm like, yeah, I'm gonna come through when I get off.
Robert indicated that he stopped by his employer to get paid, and from there, he went to Kayla's apartment.
So what time do you think you got to Kayla?
By like 3:30.
And what happened when you got there?
Man, I was talking, you know what I'm saying? And she told me that she had one son. So, man,
He said they hung out for a while, they had sex, then he had to leave to go and walk his dog.
So you think you left there at what time?
I left there by around 6:30.
If Robert is telling the truth, that means he left about 2 hours before Kayla's apartment caught fire.
He said he spent the rest of the evening with his 9-year-old son.
Robert says he only learned of Kayla's murder after getting a call from his friend, Noelle.
Noelle told him that she had seen on Facebook that Kayla was dead, that in fact people were writing, "Rest in peace, Kayla." He said he couldn't believe it.
I'm like, man, stop playing with me. She ain't dead. She can't be. She like, yeah. So then I hung up the phone with her. I called her sister, Cheyenne.
He called me and asked me if Kayla was all right. And I'm like, what do you mean if she's all right?
She was like, oh, they blaming you. I said, blaming me? I said, man, it's crazy because I ain't do nothing.
So Robert says when he got the call from detectives, he was eager to clear his name.
Robert says he had nothing to do with it. He wasn't there.
But is he telling the truth? Before concluding their interview, detectives want to ask Robert about Kayla's new boyfriend, Cedric.
He admits he knows Kayla had been dating Cedric.
The other boyfriend comes over around a certain time. She was back messing with him, this and that.
Surprisingly, Robert says he had actually agreed to the arrangement.
I said, man, we still can mess around. I don't care, no, I get me. You know what I'm saying? And we just had a mutual understanding.
Robert admits he had been messing around with other women too, including his friend Noelle.
So was it like a girlfriend, or was it just someone you were seeing?
It was like, man, I was having sex, but she knew about Kayla. She knew I had other girls, so...
Did Kayla know about her?
Nah, she didn't know about her.
Robert claims Cedric was also in the dark about what was going on behind closed doors.
According to Robert, he and Kayla had started seeing each other again, but Cedric did not know.
He knew that Robert was like some guy she used to just talk to. You know, just like an ex.
And he was still trying to figure out about me. He asked me in my inbox, oh, you had messing with her? I'm like, nah, I wasn't finna snitch on him, you know what I'm saying?
This love triangle is becoming more of a love square, and it's getting messier and messier.
In speaking with the on and off boyfriend of murder victim Kayla Gloucester, Miami-Dade detectives have learned she was embroiled in a complicated love triangle.
According to her family, Kayla broke up with Robert and started dating Cedric, but Robert says he and Kayla were still very much together.
Robert just admitted that him and Kayla had just had sex in her apartment just a few hours before she was killed.
But Robert claims he and Kayla had a special arrangement.
I said, man, we still the best friend.
They were both seeing other people on the side. While Kayla was dating Cedric, Robert was hooking up with his friend Noel.
Just then, investigators make a telling observation about Robert's hands.
He had some injuries on his hand that would be consistent with someone who may have engaged in stabbing someone and cut themselves.
However, Robert quickly offers up a defense.
He said, oh, I do construction. That's how that happened.
Now, the investigators are even more suspicious of Robert, but they'll need additional evidence before they can make an arrest in this case.
Investigators asked him if he'd consent to giving a DNA sample. And Robert agreed to let them take the sample.
As detectives await the results of the DNA test, the report from Kayla's autopsy comes in. And what it says stuns everyone.
The autopsy results show Kayla wasn't just stabbed in the neck and set on fire. She was also choked and drowned.
She had been strangled to the point that a blood vessel in her eye had burst.
She had water in her lungs. Her lungs was twice the size of a person of her stature. Just a lot of water she swallowed.
Detectives already knew they were dealing with a brutal crime, but this takes it one step further.
This is overkill.
It was a multiple of things that killed her, meaning that she suffered. She was suffering.
And detectives soon get another surprise. A visit from Robert Holton's alleged friend and lover, Noel.
In the interview with Robert Holton, he had told the detectives, Noel told him of the death of Kayla.
But according to Noel, there was much more to the story than that.
Robert said, hey, you know what? I'm just going to come by your house.
Robert picked Noel up, and they continued their conversation on the road.
At some point, she joked with him that, oh, I know you did it. And he joked back with her, oh, how did you know?
Then the conversation took a dark turn.
Robert asked Noel to help him with his alibi, and she's like, oh my God, he really did it.
Robert confessed to her that he had killed Kayla.
He indicated that he just lost it. He lost control.
According to Noel, it all began when Robert and Kayla were getting intimate earlier that evening, but he could tell Kayla wasn't into it.
Therefore, he was having some difficulty performing, so he asked Kayla to give him oral sex. She declined.
He got offended and started calling her names, so she told him to get out.
Get out. Get out now.
Robert said that the fight ensued. He indicated that Kayla hit him.
Kayla mentioned that Cedric was better than him.
And that really set Robert off.
He just lost it. He lost control.
He clicked, and he picked Kayla up and slammed her. And like kind of dazed her.
Then he dragged her into the bathroom and attempted to drown her in the toilet and strangle her.
But the attack didn't end there.
He went to the kitchen, he grabbed a knife, he came back and stabbed Kayla.
It wasn't just like one hit and she was out. She gave him a run for his money. She was fighting for her life.
Once Kayla was dead, Robert knew he needed to cover his tracks.
When he first tried to set the mattress on fire, it wouldn't take.
So he went and he got some motor oil from his car and brought it back to set the place on fire.
After torching the mattress, he went back to try and burn Kayla's body as well, assuming the flames would destroy all the evidence.
Then Robert left Kayla in the bathroom, laying in her own blood, with the apartment on fire.
8.5 hours later, when Robert asked Noelle to help him with his alibi, she couldn't believe what she was hearing.
He asked her if the police asked her any questions, if she would tell them that he was there at her apartment until 10 o'clock that night.
Noelle was understandably resistant to get involved in this, and that made Robert angry.
As they were talking, he became more aggressive and angry. So aggressive and angry that she wanted to get out of the car.
But Robert wasn't having it.
She said, I am so scared.
She was trapped inside a moving car with this maniac.
In November of 2013, a young woman named Noelle is telling Miami-Dade detectives a harrowing tale about her alleged friend-turned-lover, Robert Holton.
Robert admitted to Noelle that he killed Kayla Gloucester and tried to force her into helping him out with his alibi.
But according to Noelle, when she resisted, Robert turned his anger onto her.
She said, I am so scared.
You can't say nothing.
She was trapped inside a moving car with this maniac.
At the next stop, Noelle took off running.
He tried to chase her in the car, but she was still able to escape from him.
Once Noelle fled from Robert, Robert called her multiple times. He threatened her, told her she should not talk to the police.
Noelle's statement is a vital piece of evidence for the investigators.
Detectives get a warrant for Robert's phone records.
And when those cell phone records are received, they tell a different story than the one Robert has told the police.
Originally, Robert told police he was several miles away near his home when the fire in Kayla's apartment began.
Despite his testimony, his phone was pinging on cell towers near Kayla's apartment as late as 8:57 that evening.
That's just minutes before rescuers arrived on the scene. For investigators, this is huge.
The dots are connected. He had lied about where he was, and his phone records prove that.
Furthermore, a search of Robert's criminal history reveals he has a lengthy rap sheet.
He had assault charges for an unrelated incident.
There had been instances of domestic violence.
Unfortunately, though, investigators will need more evidence to officially charge Robert with Kayla's murder.
Even with the phone logs and Noelle's testimony, they wanted physical evidence to connect Robert to the crime.
They did not want him to get away with it, and they were very meticulous, and they took their time.
Detectives' last hope rests on the results of the forensic testing.
The labs sometimes take months, if not years, to return the results of DNA samples.
During the time of the police investigation, Robert was not in custody.
I just knew that he was out. My best friend is gone. We knew he did it. And we just felt like he was just out, just roaming.
He was like making Facebook posts like, oh yeah, y'all thought I killed Kayla. Why would I do that to my ex?
He was out boasting and bragging. Oh, I ain't did nothing. Man, I'm free. They let me go. I'm free.
As the weeks and months drag on, Kayla's family begins to wonder if they'll ever see justice.
I didn't have any words. I just wanted him to serve the consequences of the wrong that he did to her.
According to Kayla's father, he eventually tried to take matters into his own hands.
I went to his mama's house, I knocked on the door. He put the police on me. He told the police her dad is a problem, he pushing the issue. And I was like, you damn right I'm gonna push the issue. You damn right, that's my child.
In fall of 2014, detectives finally received the call they've been waiting for from the forensics lab.
It took almost a year before detectives were able to get the results of those DNA samples, but it was a match.
Robert Holton's DNA was a match for blood found at the crime scene.
That would be very hard to explain unless he was involved in the attack on Kayla.
This indicates that while Robert was stabbing Kayla, he cut himself. And this blood was proof of that fact.
Now you going down, baby. They got evidence on your behind.
On October 15th, 2014, Miami police arrest Robert at home.
Thank you, Jesus, honey. Because it was already done and said.
Just receiving that call, it was a big relief because I was like, I knew it.
It's a small victory, but detectives know they still have work to do. They continue to press Robert for answers.
He's trying to say, oh, when he left her, she was still alive. That was his argument, that yeah, I was there, but I had left.
At this point, detectives know Robert is lying.
It bothered you that she was seeing somebody else. You can't be in love with her like that and not be bothered at knowing that some other guy's in her.
Nah, not really, because if that's the case, I would have went back with her. To be honest with you, you're full of Robert.
I want to be the second boyfriend. That's what he told me over the phone. But men don't do stuff like that. We want to be number one.
Robert constantly denies that he was in fact involved in Kayla's murder. Over and over again, he says, I didn't kill that girl.
I didn't kill this
Robert.
girl, man. I did not kill this girl, man.
Robert.
Detectives tell Robert they have everything they need to prove him guilty, with or without a confession.
The evidence is there. Everything is laid out.
Eventually, Robert says that he wants an attorney.
That's all you need to say, Robert. That's all you need to say. It's over from this point.
Once police leave, Robert finally appears to feel the full weight of the charges against him.
Yeah, this bull crap. My blood mixed with her blood. Ain't nowhere in the world. It was not mixed with her blood, man. He's tripping.
He now realizes he's caught. So yeah, he was scared. He was definitely scared.
Investigators charge Robert with second-degree murder as well as arson. And 1 year later, in 2015, Robert finally goes on trial. According to Kayla's loved ones, Robert's demeanor in court adds to their pain.
Robert couldn't even look her mom in her eyes. He couldn't even face her.
I felt we was doing an exorcism in court. That's what I felt.
But just as Kayla's family is preparing to receive justice for their loved one, the court proceedings come to a grinding halt.
The judge is forced to declare a mistrial.
In 2015, nearly 2 years after the brutal death of 22-year-old Kayla Gloucester, her former boyfriend, Robert Holton, finally stands trial for murder. But getting justice for Kayla will be easier said than done.
A detective had stated during his testimony that Robert Holton was involved in another crime.
They couldn't mention that.
There's certain evidence that has to be excluded because they believe it's too prejudicial.
So the judge decided that in the interest of justice, that case would end in a mistrial.
It's a tough blow, but there is one silver lining for Kayla's family.
When prosecutors initially indicted Robert, they went with second-degree murder to be safe because they weren't sure if they'd be able to prove premeditation. But after the first trial, they felt more confident.
It was beneficial for us because then the charges changed. When it was second degree, it went to first.
And now, with the first-degree murder charges, Robert is eligible for the death penalty.
However, Kayla's loved ones must wait 8 grueling years for another trial.
I was very impatient. You're right, like I wanted him to pay for what he had done.
Finally, in August 2023, with a brand new jury, Robert once again faces the court. But this time, a new problem arises.
The jury decided that they could not reach a unanimous verdict.
You had one person that didn't want blood on their hands because it was a death penalty case.
One mistrial may happen. 2 mistrials is a lot less common.
For Kayla's family, the announcement of a second mistrial is a crushing blow. But in April 2024, the stage is set once again.
Everyone is hoping third time's a charm.
In their third time presenting the case, prosecutors argue Kayla's murder was an act of jealousy and control.
His methods was very calculated, and he used that to his advantage to keep being in her life.
But when Kayla flipped the script on Robert, he couldn't handle it.
She started flourishing in another relationship with someone else, and that someone was Cedric.
When Kayla threw Cedric in Robert's face, something in him snapped and he unleashed all the rage that was building inside him.
I don't think she was afraid of him, honestly, but she didn't think that it would get this far, to be honest. She thought she had it under control.
When the jury retires to deliberate, Kayla's loved ones are anxious for the results.
I was on pins and needles. Didn't know what was going to happen again.
But this time, the jury is able to reach a unanimous decision.
Robert Holton was declared guilty of first-degree murder and guilty of arson.
It was just so full of emotion. Like, you could hear the relief in the courtroom.
I could breathe now, just thinking, God, thank you. Justice has prevailed.
However, the jury decides against the death penalty.
The jurors decided to spare Robert's life and recommended to the judge a sentence of life without parole.
I feel like life is better anyways, so you can sit and dwell on what you did.
He got to suffer like he made her suffer. That's what he got to do.
This was a case that shows that with patience and determination, a person doesn't have to get away with murder.
Although Kayla's family is relieved to see justice served, they still live with the hurt of losing their loved one in such a devastating way.
As a father, I'd be lying if I said I didn't want no revenge or some get back. Of course I want Robert dead, but with my belief, I know I have to find some type of way to forgive because God is the ultimate authority.
I can't.
On a cold February night in 1974, 17-year-old Carla Jan Walker disappeared from a Fort Worth parking lot. And within hours, a frantic search was underway for a girl whose family believed she would come home. She never did. 3 days later, investigators found her body in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, roughly 30 minutes south of Fort Worth. and the discovery transformed a terrifying kidnapping into a murder investigation that would remain unresolved for 46 years. What investigators did not know that night was that the person responsible had left behind something that would survive the decades: biological evidence. At the time, however, DNA technology could not turn that evidence into a name. The killer would remain unidentified while Carla's family lived through birthdays, anniversaries, holidays, and decades of unanswered questions. And somewhere inside an old evidence file was a clue that would eventually change everything. Carla was a high school student at Western Hills High School, remembered as a spirited young woman and cheerleader, a teenager with an ordinary future stretching ahead of her. On the evening of February 17th, she had attended a dance before spending time with her boyfriend, Rodney McCoy. They eventually ended up sitting together inside McCoy's car in the parking lot of what was then the Brunswick Ridgely Bowl. It was the kind of place where a teenager could expect an ordinary night to end with a ride home, a conversation, and another school day waiting on Monday. Instead, the passenger door suddenly opened. A stranger appeared. McCoy was attacked and pistol whipped, while Carla was forcibly pulled from the vehicle. The attack was violent and sudden. McCoy would later tell investigators that he saw Carla being taken away by a man he described as white and approximately 5 feet 10 inches tall. Then the parking lot fell silent. Carla was gone. The attacker had disappeared, but he had made one mistake. During the assault, a magazine from a Ruger .22 caliber pistol was left behind in the parking lot near Carla's purse. That small object would become one of the earliest physical clues in the investigation. Detectives began working backward from it, trying to determine who in the area had owned or purchased a weapon compatible with the magazine. In 1974, however, investigators were operating in a world without the forensic tools available today. There was no modern genetic genealogy. There was no ability to search hundreds of thousands of genetic relatives. DNA profiling itself was not yet a practical investigative tool. Detectives had to rely on witness descriptions, physical evidence, interviews, records, and whatever information they could obtain from the community. Hundreds of leads were reportedly followed, and among the names that surfaced was a Fort Worth man named Glenn Samuel McCurley. McCurley had purchased a .22 Ruger, the same general type of weapon associated with the magazine found at the bowling alley. Police questioned him less than 2 months after Carla was killed. He told investigators that his pistol had been stolen before the murder. He also provided an explanation for his whereabouts around the time of the crime. Investigators even administered a polygraph examination, and McCurley passed it. At that point, police did not have enough evidence to arrest him, and the investigation moved on. The name that would eventually become central to the case was therefore already somewhere inside the original investigation, but there was no scientific bridge connecting McCurley to Carla's murder. There was suspicion, there were questions, there was the firearm connection, but suspicion was not proof, and without the technology to analyze the biological evidence properly, investigators could not establish the connection they needed, so the years began to accumulate. 1 year became 5. 5 became 10, 10 became 20, then 30. Carla's family continued waiting. Her brother Jim Walker was only 12 when his sister was murdered, and he would later describe the pain of watching his family live without answers. His parents would eventually die without knowing who had killed their daughter. That detail gives the case its deepest tragedy. Solving a murder is not simply about identifying a suspect. For the people left behind, every year without an answer is another year in which the victim remains suspended between memory and uncertainty. Carla remained 17 forever. Her family continued aging. The investigators who had worked the original case moved on or retired. Technology changed. Police procedures changed. Society changed. But the question did not change. Who killed Carla Walker, and why? The case eventually became cold, not because the crime had become less important, but because the available evidence had reached the limits of what investigators could do with it. The biological material was there, but science had not yet learned how to extract everything it contained. That distinction would become crucial decades later. In 2018 and 2019, renewed attention began building around Carla's case. A podcast episode helped bring the story back into public discussion, while friends of the Walker family pushed for renewed investigative attention. Detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett of the Fort Worth Police Department's Cold Case Unit reopened the investigation and began reviewing the old case file, including the names of people investigators had considered decades earlier. McCurley was still on that list, but now the detectives had something their predecessors had not possessed: modern forensic science. Old evidence from Carla's clothing was sent for renewed DNA testing. Scientists were able to develop a single-source male DNA profile from genetic material recovered from Carla's bra, something that earlier testing had not been able to accomplish. The result was extraordinary because the evidence had effectively been silent for decades, and now it was speaking. But the first answer was still frustrating. The DNA profile did not match a person in the FBI's National CODIS database. The unknown man remained unknown. For a moment, it looked as though history might repeat itself. The investigators had a genetic profile, but no name. Yet the science had changed enough that an unknown DNA profile no longer necessarily meant a dead end. The detectives turned toward forensic genetic genealogy, a developing investigative technique capable of searching for biological relationships rather than simply looking for an exact criminal database match. Instead of asking, "Who is this man?" investigators could ask, "Who is genetically related to this man?" That difference was enormous. Genetic genealogy could potentially transform an anonymous DNA profile into a family tree, and a family tree could eventually lead investigators toward a specific individual. The profile was sent to specialists, including Othram, a forensic laboratory in Texas that worked with advanced DNA analysis and genealogical investigation. What happened next would seem almost impossible compared with the original investigation. The unknown DNA began pointing toward a surname, McCurley. The name was not random. It was already sitting inside the old police file. Decades earlier, investigators had questioned a McCurley because of the point to 2 Ruger connection. Now, modern DNA science was independently pointing investigators back toward the same family, and suddenly the past was no longer buried. The old suspect list was no longer simply a historical document. It had become a roadmap. Investigators narrowed the genealogical possibilities to 3 McCurley brothers. One of those brothers was Glenn Samuel McCurley. The man police had questioned in 1974 was still alive nearly half a century later. He had remained in the Fort Worth area. He had lived a life, raised a family, and existed in the same community while Carla's murder remained unsolved. But detectives still could not simply declare him guilty. A genealogical connection was an investigative lead. They needed direct DNA confirmation, so the investigation entered another critical phase. Detectives obtained discarded material from outside McCurley's home and recovered DNA that could be tested against the profile from Carla's clothing. The result was the confirmation they had been searching for. The DNA matched. After 46 years, the anonymous biological profile had a name. The suspect who had once been questioned and released was suddenly at the center of a murder investigation again. On September 21, 2020, police arrested 77-year-old Glenn Samuel McCurley at his Fort Worth home and charged him with capital murder. For Carla's family, the news was staggering. The case that had consumed generations had finally moved. A name had become a suspect. A suspect had become an arrest, and the evidence that made it possible had been collected decades earlier, waiting for science to catch up. But even then, one question remained hanging over the investigation like a shadow. What had really happened inside the darkness of that February night? And why had Carla been targeted? The DNA could identify the man connected to the evidence, but it could not explain the mind behind the crime. It could not restore the 17-year-old girl whose future had been stolen. It could not give her parents the decades they lost waiting for an answer. And it could not erase the fact that the man police had once questioned had remained free for nearly half a century. The arrest was therefore not the end of Carla Walker's story. It was the moment when a 46-year silence finally cracked open, revealing that the answer had been closer than anyone realized, hidden inside evidence that had survived long after memories faded. And as investigators prepared to bring the case into court, the question that had haunted Fort Worth since 1974 was no longer simply who killed Carla Walker. Now there was a name. Glenn Samuel McCurley, and for the first time in decades, that name was attached to the evidence. The name had returned to the file, but this time it carried something the investigators of 1974 never had: DNA. For nearly half a century, Glenn Samuel McCurley had existed in the history of the Carla Walker investigation as a possibility that had been examined and then set aside. In 1974, detectives knew he owned a Ruger .22, the same general type of weapon associated with the magazine recovered from the bowling alley parking lot. They questioned him. He told them the gun had been stolen. He underwent a polygraph examination and was not arrested. The case eventually went cold, but when Fort Worth detectives Leo Wagner and Jeff Bennett reopened the investigation decades later, McCurley's name was still there, buried among the old leads, waiting for someone to look at it with modern eyes. The breakthrough began with evidence that had survived since the night Carla was abducted. Investigators sent items from the original case for advanced DNA testing. A single-source male DNA profile was developed from genetic material recovered from Carla's bra. That profile did not match anyone in the FBI's national DNA database. In another era, that might have been the end of the road. But this was no longer 1974. Scientists had developed methods capable of examining an unknown genetic profile in far greater detail, and the Fort Worth investigators turned to Othram, a Texas laboratory specializing in advanced forensic DNA analysis. The laboratory used forensic-grade genomic sequencing to examine the unknown male profile, and the investigation began moving from an anonymous biological sample toward a family connection. Then came the phone call that changed everything. In July 2020, investigators were informed that the genetic information pointed toward a family name, McCurley. Detective Jeff Bennett recognized it immediately. The surname was not simply another possibility generated by a database. It was already in the original case file. 46 years earlier, investigators had questioned a man named Glenn Samuel McCurley. Now modern genetic analysis was leading them back toward that same name. 3 McCurley brothers emerged as possible relatives. Investigators had a direction, but they still did not have enough to make an arrest. Genetic genealogy could point investigators toward a person, but it could not replace the need for direct forensic confirmation. Detectives needed McCurley's DNA, and that meant they had to watch him without revealing that the investigation had suddenly come back to life. They collected discarded material from his trash and sent it for testing. Among the items was a drinking straw. The DNA recovered from it matched the male profile developed from Carla's clothing. Investigators then obtained a direct DNA sample from McCurley, which also matched. The biological evidence had now crossed a line that could not easily be ignored. The unknown male connected to Carla was no longer anonymous. He was Glenn Samuel McCurley. And yet the most astonishing part of the story was still ahead, because the detectives were not confronting a stranger who had suddenly appeared from nowhere. They were confronting a man whose name had already been written into the investigation nearly half a century earlier. That fact changed the emotional temperature of the case. In 1974, investigators had been working with fragments, a weapon connection, a witness description, a magazine found near the scene, a man who owned a compatible Ruger, a statement that the gun had been stolen, a polygraph result, no definitive biological identification, no modern genetic technology, no way to connect the unknown male DNA to a living suspect. The investigation could only go as far as the available evidence allowed. Now the same case had returned with a completely different set of tools. The old evidence had become new evidence. The old suspect had become a genetic match, and the question was no longer whether McCurley might somehow be connected to Carla's murder. The question was what he would say when detectives confronted him with the evidence. In September 2020, investigators went to McCurley's Fort Worth home and interviewed him. He was 77 years old. The interview began calmly. For a time, he denied knowing Carla or having anything to do with her death. He repeated the explanation he had given decades earlier about the Ruger, telling detectives that the weapon had been stolen. But investigators now had something different to show him. They had DNA. They had the old case file. They had the new forensic result. And they had spent months rebuilding a case that had once seemed impossible to solve. According to testimony later presented in court, the interview eventually changed direction. Detectives confronted McCurley with the DNA evidence. His resistance began to break down. Prosecutors later played portions of the recorded interview for the jury, revealing how the questioning unfolded. McCurley eventually admitted to killing Carla. He told investigators that he had been drinking whiskey and beer and driving around Fort Worth that night. He initially offered an account that attempted to portray the encounter differently, but investigators continued pressing him about the evidence. Eventually, according to the trial record, he acknowledged that he had strangled Carla. There was another detail that would become extraordinarily important. McCurley told detectives where the Ruger pistol was hidden. Investigators executed a search warrant at his home and found the weapon concealed in the ceiling. The gun that McCurley had told investigators in 1974 had been stolen was now reportedly found hidden inside his home decades later. The discovery gave the old firearm clue an entirely different significance. What had once been an unresolved lead had become part of a much larger evidentiary picture. For Carla's family, the revelations were devastating and overwhelming. They had spent decades imagining the moment someone would finally tell them who had killed her, but the truth arrived with details that no family could ever truly be prepared to hear. Carla had been 17. Her brother Jim was only 12 when she was murdered. His parents died without knowing the identity of their daughter's killer. That meant the breakthrough in 2020 was not simply an investigative victory. It was also a confrontation with the passage of time. The people who had spent the most years waiting for answers were no longer all alive to hear them. The arrest came on September 21st, 2020. McCurley was taken into custody at his Fort Worth home and charged with capital murder. After 46 years, the investigation had finally crossed the threshold from cold case to active prosecution. But an arrest did not automatically settle the questions surrounding the evidence. McCurley's defense challenged the DNA testing and the circumstances under which investigators had obtained DNA from his discarded trash. His attorneys also challenged the admissibility of the forensic testing and later argued that statements made during the police interview should not be used against him. Those challenges meant the case would have to survive scrutiny inside a courtroom, not merely convince investigators. And that courtroom battle mattered because the case had become a test of something much larger than one murder. It was becoming a test of how far modern genetic technology could reach into the past and whether evidence generated through relatively new forensic methods could withstand legal examination. The defense questioned the accreditation and licensing associated with some of the laboratories and personnel involved in the DNA analysis. Prosecutors argued that the scientific evidence was reliable and admissible. The judge ultimately allowed the contested evidence to proceed toward trial. The legal arguments revealed just how complicated the investigation had become. The DNA that identified McCurley was not a simple laboratory result produced overnight. It was the product of old evidence, modern extraction techniques, advanced sequencing, genealogical analysis, discarded DNA, and eventually direct comparison. Every step created another opportunity for the defense to challenge the process, and yet the prosecution had something else: McCurley's own recorded statements. According to the later appellate record, he had admitted to killing Carla. He had also directed investigators to the location of the Ruger, which they found inside his home. The case finally reached trial in August 2021, nearly 47 years after Carla's murder. The first days were filled with painful testimony. Rodney McCoy, Carla's boyfriend, returned to the story he had carried since he was 17 years old. He described sitting with Carla in the car that night when the passenger door suddenly opened. He described being struck with a pistol. He described Carla being pulled away, and he remembered the last words she said to him, "Go get my dad." Those words were more than evident. They were the final fragment of Carla's voice preserved from the night she disappeared. Nearly half a century had passed, but inside that courtroom, the timeline seemed to collapse. The teenager who had spoken those words was suddenly present again through the testimony of the boy who had heard them. The family listened. Friends listened. Investigators listened. And across the courtroom sat the man prosecutors said had taken her. Then came the evidence itself. Investigators brought out the old clothing preserved from the 1974 investigation. Carla's dress, the garments connected to the crime scene. Items that had spent decades sealed away, evidence that had survived longer than some of the people who originally collected it. The DNA extracted from Carla's bra became one of the central pieces of the prosecution's case. Scientists explained how modern techniques had produced a usable male profile from material that could not have been fully analyzed in the 1970s. The science that had been impossible when Carla was alive was now being explained to a jury almost half a century later. And then the prosecution played the interview. McCurley's voice filled the courtroom. At first, he denied involvement. Then the detectives confronted him with the evidence. The story changed. The man who had once told police his gun had been stolen was now discussing the murder. The man who had remained outside the reach of the investigation for decades was describing what investigators believed had happened to Carla, and the courtroom was forced to listen as the old mystery finally began to speak in the suspect's own voice. But even with the DNA, the gun, and the recorded statements, McCurley initially pleaded not guilty. The trial continued. For 2 days, testimony and evidence were presented. Then, on the third day, something happened that no one in the courtroom expected. McCurley changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder. The judge accepted the plea and sentenced him to life in prison. The 46-year mystery had reached its legal conclusion. But the moment did not feel like a celebration. Carla's family cried. Friends embraced. The courtroom became a place where two families, connected by a crime neither had chosen, were forced to confront the consequences of what had happened. McCurley's son Roddy approached Carla's brother Jim Walker. The two men embraced and cried together. It was one of the most unexpected images of the case, because the victim's brother and the convicted killer's son were standing together in the same courtroom, both devastated by a crime that had shaped their lives in completely different ways. And even after McCurley pleaded guilty, one question remained hanging in the air. 46 years earlier, investigators had already questioned him. They had already known his name. They had already known about the Ruger. Yet they had not been able to prove what they suspected. Now, decades later, DNA had returned to the same name and provided the missing connection. The case had come full circle, but the circle was not complete for Carla's family. They had an answer, but they could never have the years back. They had a conviction, but not their sister and daughter. They had the truth, but the truth arrived after generations had already passed, and as the courtroom emptied and McCurley began his life sentence, the old case file that had once represented failure now represented something else entirely. Proof that evidence can wait longer than people expect, that a name can disappear from an investigation without disappearing from history, and that a mystery considered unsolvable in one generation can become solvable in another. Carla Walker had been 17 when she vanished. She was still 17 when her family finally learned who had killed her. The difference was that 46 years had passed between those two moments, and the evidence had been waiting all that time for someone to finally understand what it was saying. The most unsettling thing about a cold case is not the silence. It is the possibility that the silence is hiding something that has been there all along. For Carla Walker, that possibility became reality. The evidence collected after her murder in 1974 had survived for decades, and when investigators finally returned to it with modern forensic technology, it began revealing information that had been impossible to obtain when Carla was alive. The old case file was no longer simply a record of an unsolved murder. It had become a time capsule preserving biological evidence, witness statements, physical objects, and investigative leads from a night that had otherwise begun to disappear into history. By the time Fort Worth detectives reopened the investigation, the people who had originally worked the case were separated from it by nearly half a century. Memories had faded, technology had transformed, and Carla's family had endured decades without knowing who had taken her life. Yet the evidence had remained. That distinction became the foundation of everything that followed. The unknown male DNA profile recovered from Carla's clothing was especially important because it gave investigators something objective that could be tested against modern technology. Traditional DNA databases had failed to identify the source, but that did not mean the biological evidence was useless. It meant the investigators needed a different way to interpret it. Genetic genealogy provided that route. Instead of searching only for an exact match to a known offender, investigators could examine genetic relationships and look for relatives of the unknown person. The approach was powerful precisely because the person responsible did not have to be sitting inside a law enforcement database. A distant relative could provide the first connection. From that connection, genealogists could reconstruct family relationships, eliminate branches, identify likely surnames, and eventually narrow the search toward an individual. In Carle's case, that process led investigators toward the McCurley family, a name that carried extraordinary significance because it was already present in the original investigation. Decades earlier, police had questioned Glenn Samuel McCurley because of his ownership of a Ruger .22 and information surrounding the firearm found after Carle's abduction. At the time, investigators had not been able to establish that he was the offender. He denied involvement. He said his firearm had been stolen. He passed a polygraph examination. There was not enough evidence to arrest him. The investigation moved forward without him. Now, nearly half a century later, the science was pointing back in his direction. It was not a detective remembering an old suspicion and forcing the evidence to fit. It was a new genetic investigation arriving independently at a family connection that brought an old name back into focus. That distinction would become enormously important. Investigators could not simply say that McCurley had once been questioned, therefore he must have been responsible. They needed proof. They needed his DNA, and they needed to establish that the DNA associated with the unknown male was the same DNA found in McCurley. The detectives therefore began watching him. The investigation became quiet and deliberate. There was no dramatic confrontation at first, no flashing lights, no announcement that a 46-year-old mystery had suddenly reopened. Instead, detectives waited for an opportunity to obtain biological material that McCurley had abandoned. The discarded DNA could then be compared against the profile developed from Carle's clothing. According to the later court record, the DNA obtained from McCurley's abandoned trash was legally collected, and the resulting comparison became a central part of the case. The science had now done something the investigators of 1974 could never have accomplished. It had transformed an unknown male profile into a specific individual. But the investigators still had to confront the possibility that the DNA connection might not tell the entire story. A biological match could establish that McCurley was connected to the evidence, but detectives still needed to understand what happened on the night Carla disappeared. They needed his account. They needed to know whether he would deny everything, whether he would offer another explanation, or whether the pressure of the evidence would eventually force him to confront the past. In September 2020, detectives went to McCurley's home and questioned him. He was 77 years old. 46 years had passed since Carle's murder. The passage of time was almost impossible to comprehend. A teenager had disappeared in 1974. The investigation had gone cold. Generations had grown up, and now the detectives were speaking to a 77-year-old man about a crime committed when he was young. At first, according to the evidence later discussed in court, McCurley denied killing Carla. But the detectives had something the investigators of the 1970s had never possessed. They could confront him with a DNA result. They could explain that the biological evidence recovered from Carla was connected to him. They could ask questions while knowing that the case was no longer built solely on suspicion. It was built on forensic evidence. The interview eventually produced statements that became critical to the prosecution. McCurley admitted involvement in Carla's killing, and according to the later court record, he also told investigators where a firearm was located inside his home. Investigators searched the property and recovered a Ruger .22 hidden in the ceiling. The discovery gave the old firearm evidence a new and disturbing significance. The gun that McCurley had previously said was stolen had apparently remained in his possession for decades. The weapon itself would become another piece of the prosecution's case, connecting a physical object from the original investigation with the man whose DNA had now been identified. The case was no longer a collection of disconnected clues. It was becoming a chain. Carla's clothing, the male DNA profile, the genealogical investigation, the McCurley family connection, the discarded DNA, the direct comparison, the interview, the firearm, each element pointed toward the same conclusion, and yet the legal system still required the evidence to withstand challenges. McCurley's defense challenged aspects of the forensic testing and the circumstances surrounding the collection and use of his DNA. Those challenges eventually reached the Texas Appellate Court. In 2022, the Second Court of Appeals addressed several of those issues, including the argument that McCurley's confession had been improperly obtained, the licensing of a DNA analyst, and whether McCurley had standing to challenge the warrantless collection of DNA from abandoned trash. The appellate court rejected those challenges, concluding, among other things, that his DNA had been legally obtained from abandoned trash. That legal battle mattered because the case was no longer simply about what detectives believed had happened. It was about whether the evidence could survive the rules governing a criminal prosecution, and that distinction became increasingly important as the investigation moved toward court. For Carla's family, however, legal arguments could not change the emotional reality. The person whose identity they had waited decades to learn was now known, but the answer had arrived after the lives of many people who had spent the longest waiting had already changed forever. Carla's parents had died without knowing who had killed their daughter. Her brother Jim Walker had grown from a 12-year-old boy into an adult carrying a memory that had never left him. The family had spent decades living with a question that could not be answered. Now the question had a name. But that name brought its own pain, because knowing who killed Carla meant confronting what that person had allegedly done. It meant hearing the details spoken aloud. It meant seeing the case move from the private world of family grief into the public world of criminal prosecution. And when the case eventually reached trial, those decades of silence would be broken inside a courtroom. The prosecution would present evidence from the original crime. Witnesses would describe the night Carla disappeared. Forensic specialists would explain the DNA. Detectives would describe the genetic genealogy investigation. And the jury would hear the recorded interview with McCurley. The past would be reconstructed piece by piece. The prosecution did not have to invent a story. The old evidence already existed. What changed was the ability to connect it. That is what made Carla's case so significant. The science did not create a suspect out of nothing. It gave investigators a path back to evidence that had been waiting for interpretation. The same name that had appeared in the original investigation resurfaced through a completely different method nearly 5 decades later. That convergence was extraordinary. It also demonstrated one of the most important realities of forensic genealogy. The genealogical result itself is not the final proof. It is a lead. Investigators must still obtain direct evidence linking the identified person to the crime. In Carla's case, that direct DNA comparison became crucial. The genealogical path pointed investigators toward McCurley. The forensic comparison then connected his DNA to the biological material from the case. The interview provided additional evidence. The firearm recovery added another physical connection, and the legal process tested each element. By the time the case reached court, the question was no longer whether investigators had a theory. They had evidence. The final stage would be about whether McCurley would contest that evidence before a jury or accept responsibility in court. In August 2021, after decades of uncertainty, the case finally reached its decisive moment. McCurley had initially pleaded not guilty, but during the trial he changed his plea and pleaded guilty to capital murder. He was sentenced to life in prison. The courtroom had finally delivered the answer that Carla's family had waited nearly half a century to hear. But the emotional weight of that moment could not be measured by the length of a prison sentence. Carla had been 17 when she was murdered. Her killer was 77 when he was arrested. Between those ages was an entire lifetime. 46 years of birthdays. 46 years of holidays. 46 years of ordinary mornings and ordinary nights. 46 years during which Carla remained frozen in the memory of the people who loved her while the world continued moving forward. And now, finally, the investigation had caught up with the past. The case had a suspect. The suspect had become a defendant. The defendant had become a convicted murderer. But the most haunting part was still the evidence itself. It had never stopped existing. It had simply waited. The DNA had waited. The old case file had waited. The physical evidence had waited. And when technology finally became capable of unlocking the information inside that evidence, the silence surrounding Carla Walker-West's murder began to collapse. What had seemed lost was not lost. What had seemed forgotten had not been forgotten. Somewhere inside the evidence, the past had been holding its answer for 46 years, and now that answer had finally been heard. The courtroom was now carrying a burden that had been waiting nearly half a century to be spoken aloud, because when the trial of Glenn Samuel McCurley began, the murder of Carla Walker was no longer an old photograph, no longer a faded case number, and no longer a mystery discussed in whispers by people who remembered a terrible night in 1974. It was evidence. It was testimony. It was DNA. It was the voice of a man accused of taking a 17-year-old girl from a parking lot and killing her. And sitting inside that courtroom were people who had waited decades for this moment. People who had grown older while Carla remained forever 17. People who had watched the case become cold and then watched it suddenly come alive again through science that did not exist when the murder occurred. And when prosecutors began presenting the history of the case, they were not simply telling the jury about something that happened long ago. They were reconstructing a night that had remained unfinished for 46 years, beginning with Carla and Rodney McCoy at the bowling alley parking lot, the sudden appearance of a gunman, the attack on McCoy, the abduction of Carla, and the desperate words she spoke before she was taken away, because those final moments were among the most important pieces of testimony in the entire case, not because they identified the killer, but because they captured Carla alive, frightened, and still believing that someone could help her, and that human detail gave the case a dimension that no DNA profile could provide, because behind every forensic sample was a 17-year-old girl who had been sitting in a car with her boyfriend, expecting to go home, and instead found herself being dragged into a nightmare that would end her life while McCoy survived the attack. Investigators began searching for Carla, and the community reacted with growing fear as the hours passed without her return. And 3 days later, the search ended in horror when her body was discovered in a culvert near Benbrook Lake, and the investigation immediately became a homicide case. But even then, the killer had already created distance between himself and the crime. Because Carla was dead, the scene had been abandoned, and whoever had taken her was gone, leaving detectives with fragments that would take decades to assemble. And among those fragments was the magazine from a Ruger Point .22 found near the bowling alley, a clue that seemed important because investigators believed it had been connected to the weapon used during the attack, and that led them toward Glenn McCurley, who owned a Ruger Point .22, but in 1974, owning a similar firearm did not establish that a person had committed a murder, and McCurley told police his gun had been stolen, while his polygraph result gave investigators no immediate reason to disregard his account. And without DNA technology capable of identifying the unknown biological material, the case could not make the leap from suspicion to proof. So the investigation continued, leads were followed, interviews were conducted, and eventually the trail disappeared into the enormous landscape of unsolved crimes. And for Carla's family, the disappearance of that investigative trail did not mean the disappearance of the pain, because the questions remained, and every year that passed made the absence more permanent, while the family had to continue living with the knowledge that somewhere in the world was a person who knew what had happened to Carla, and that person had never been held accountable. And this is what makes a cold case different from an ordinary unanswered question, because there is a human being at the center of it, someone whose life was interrupted and whose family is left with a permanent gap. And in Carla's case, that gap lasted through the entire childhood and adulthood of people who had known her, until finally modern science reopened the door. And when detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett began examining the case again, they did something that seems simple but can be extraordinarily difficult in a decades-old investigation. They looked again, not because the original investigators had failed, but because the tools had changed, and the evidence could now be interpreted in ways nobody in 1974 could have imagined, and that review led to new testing of preserved biological evidence, including material recovered from Carla's clothing, and the laboratory work eventually produced a single-source male DNA profile, creating a forensic signature that could be compared with modern databases and genealogical resources. But when the profile was searched through the traditional law enforcement system, there was no direct match, meaning the killer still had no name, and for a moment, the case seemed to be standing at another wall. But investigators had learned from other cold cases that an unknown profile did not necessarily mean an impossible identification, and this was where genetic genealogy changed the direction of the investigation, because instead of looking for the exact person, scientists could look for relatives, and relatives could reveal family structures, and family structures could lead investigators toward a surname, and eventually the surname McCurley appeared, and Detective Bennett recognized it because the name had already existed inside the case file for decades, and that moment must have been extraordinary for investigators because a name that had once been only one of many investigative leads was suddenly emerging through a completely independent scientific process, and the old case and the new science were converging on the same family, but investigators still needed to be cautious because genetic genealogy could provide an investigative direction but could not by itself establish guilt, and that meant the detectives needed direct confirmation, which led them to McCurley's discarded biological material, and the DNA comparison produced the result they were looking for, connecting McCurley to the male profile recovered from evidence associated with Carla's murder, and then came the interview, where the detectives confronted a 77-year-old man with a crime committed nearly half a century earlier, and according to the evidence later presented in court, McCurley initially denied responsibility, but the detectives continued questioning him, and eventually he admitted killing Carla, with prosecutors later presenting portions of the interview to the jury. And there was another extraordinary development when McCurley told investigators where a Ruger .22 pistol was located, leading them to search his home, where they recovered a firearm hidden in the ceiling, and suddenly the weapon connection from 1974 was no longer an isolated clue because the investigation now contained the old firearm evidence, the new DNA evidence, and statements made by the suspect himself, and the case that had once consisted of fragments was becoming a tightly connected chain. But a criminal case does not end with an arrest, and the defense challenged the evidence, particularly the DNA analysis and the collection of McCurley's discarded biological material, raising questions about laboratory procedures, licensing, and constitutional protection. And those challenges eventually became part of the appellate record, but the courts ultimately allowed the key evidence to stand, meaning the prosecution could bring the scientific evidence before a jury. And that was crucial because the DNA was not merely background information, it was the bridge between Carla's clothing and the man sitting in the courtroom, and when the jury heard the scientific evidence, they were hearing something investigators in 1974 could never have imagined, a biological identification based on technology that had arrived decades after Carla's death, and the prosecution could explain how the unknown DNA profile had first been developed, how traditional databases failed to identify it, how genetic genealogy led investigators toward the McCurley family, and how discarded DNA provided direct confirmation. And each stage of that process helped explain why the identification was not simply an assumption, because the genealogical lead was followed by forensic testing, and the forensic testing was supported by other evidence, creating multiple independent paths toward the same conclusion. And yet the most emotionally difficult evidence came from the people who remembered Carla, because science could tell the jury who the biological evidence belonged to, but it could not tell them what it meant to lose a daughter, a sister, a friend, and a 17-year-old girl who should have lived decades beyond that February night. And Rodney McCoy's testimony brought the final moments of Carla's freedom back into the courtroom, because he was the person sitting beside her when the attacker appeared, the person who survived the assault, and the person who heard Carla tell him to get her father. And those words became a haunting reminder that she understood something terrible was happening, but had no way to stop it. And for McCoy, carrying that memory for nearly 5 decades must have meant living with a moment that never completely became the past, because trauma does not follow the calendar. And a memory from 17 years old can remain as vivid at 60 as it was on the night it happened. And when he testified, the courtroom was forced to confront not just the forensic evidence, but the human reality of the crime, because Carla had not been a case file. She had been a teenager with a boyfriend, a family, a school, and a future, and the prosecution was asking the jury to understand that the evidence belonged to that real person, not merely to a historical investigation, and the defense, meanwhile, had the responsibility of challenging the prosecution's claims, raising questions about how evidence had been collected, tested, and interpreted, because even in a case that appears overwhelming, the legal system requires proof beyond a reasonable doubt, and that standard becomes especially important when decades have passed and memories, records, and physical evidence must all be examined under modern legal scrutiny. And as the trial continued, the jury heard the story of the original investigation, the decades of silence, and the extraordinary scientific breakthrough that finally gave investigators a suspect. But there was one moment approaching that would change the case yet again, because McCurley had entered the courtroom with a not guilty plea, and prosecutors were preparing to continue presenting evidence while the family sat through the painful reconstruction of a murder that had defined their lives. But on the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea, and suddenly the courtroom did not need to hear the remaining evidence in the same way, because the man accused of killing Carla was now admitting guilt to capital murder, and the judge sentenced him to life in prison, closing a case that had remained unresolved since 1974, and yet the emotional impact of that moment could not be contained inside a legal phrase like guilty plea, because for Carla's brother, Jim, who had been 12 when she died, the moment represented something he had never expected to experience, an answer after decades of uncertainty. And when the courtroom finally heard the guilty plea, the family could look at the man responsible and know that the legal system had formally recognized what they had believed for so long. But the conviction could not restore Carla, could not return the parents who had died without answer, and could not erase the 46 years between the crime and the resolution. And that is the paradox at the heart of every cold case. Solved after decades, justice can arrive, but it cannot travel backward in time. It can establish accountability, but it cannot restore the life that was taken. And it can give a family an answer, but it cannot give them back the person they lost. And Carla's case carried that contradiction more painfully than most, because the technology that finally identified her killer had not existed when she was alive. And the investigators who finally solved the case were working with evidence collected by people who could not possibly have known that DNA genealogy would one day transform their old files, and the biological material preserved from Carla's clothing had effectively become a message sent from 1974 to the future, a message that could not be read until science caught up. And when it finally was written, it pointed toward a man whose name had already appeared in the original investigation, and the case came full circle, from the bowling alley parking lot to the culvert, from the original suspect interview to the modern laboratory, from an unknown DNA profile to a family tree, from discarded biological material to a direct match, from a 77-year-old suspect to a courtroom, and finally from a 46-year mystery to a guilty plea. But even after the legal conclusion, one question continued to haunt the story, not about who killed Carla, because that question had finally been answered, but about how many years might have been different if the technology had existed sooner, and whether Carla's family could ever know why the case had taken so long to solve, because science had provided the identity, but it could not explain the decades of silence, and it could not undo the fact that Carla had remained 17 while the world around her continued to age, and that was the final cruelty of time. It does not stop for the victim, it does not stop for the family, and it does not stop for the investigation. But in Carla Walker's case, time did not erase the evidence either, and eventually, after nearly half a century, the evidence became louder than the silence. The guilty plea had ended the courtroom uncertainty, But it did not end the questions surrounding Carla Walker's murder, because behind the final legal outcome was another disturbing possibility that investigators could not simply ignore. If Glenn Samuel McCurley had been capable of killing Carla in 1974, had anyone else crossed his path in the years before or after her death? That question would emerge only after the conviction, but its roots were already visible in the contradictions surrounding McCurley's story. The circumstances of the original investigation and the possibility that Carla's murder might not have been an isolated act. During the trial, prosecutors had shown the jury how McCurley initially denied involvement when detectives confronted him in 2020, then changed his story after investigators told him. They had DNA evidence connecting him to Carla. In the recorded interview, he eventually acknowledged responsibility for her death. He described himself as having got carried away and admitted that he had strangled Carla, while also telling investigators that he had been afraid she would tell someone what he had done. The confession was devastating, but it also left gaps. McCurley disputed some of the details surrounding the assault, and Carla's family remained troubled by what they believed was an incomplete account of that night. Her brother Jim Walker and her sister Cindy Stone wanted the full truth, not simply a conviction. They wanted to know exactly what happened after Carla was taken from the car, how long she remained alive, what McCurley had done, and whether he had ever told anyone what he had done. But perhaps most hauntingly, they wanted to know whether Carla was the only young woman whose life had intersected with McCurley in a dangerous way. Those questions became more urgent because McCurley had lived freely for decades. He had worked, raised children, attended ordinary events, moved through the same community where Carla's family lived, and remained physically close to the place where the crime had occurred. His sons attended the same school Carla had attended. His family lived a life that existed alongside the memories of the Walker family, even though they did not know the full truth. That proximity made the eventual discovery even more disturbing. The murderer had not vanished into some distant place. He had remained in the same region while Carla's family continued searching for answers. And then there was the gun. In 1974, McCurley had told investigators that his Ruger .22 had been stolen. Decades later, after his arrest, he directed investigators toward a firearm hidden inside his home, and they recovered a Ruger from the ceiling. The discovery added another layer to a story that had begun with a weapon in a bowling alley parking lot. It did not merely revive an old investigative detail. It forced investigators to look back at what they had known in 1974 and ask how much they had missed. The original detectives had not been able to prove that McCurley was the killer, and the limitations of the time mattered enormously. But the later evidence showed why the old investigation had never been completely meaningless. The clues were there. They simply could not be connected with the technology available at the time. The firearm connection, the suspect interview, the biological evidence, and the witness accounts had remained separate pieces. Modern forensic science finally gave investigators the ability to join them. Yet the story became even more complicated after McCurley's conviction. Investigators began considering whether he might have been responsible for other crimes. The possibility was not established as fact, and authorities did not publicly declare him a serial killer, but detectives acknowledged that they were examining unsolved cases for possible connection. That meant Carlet's case, although legally resolved, could potentially become the doorway to other investigations. The same forensic science that had finally identified McCurley could be used to examine old evidence from other crimes and determine whether his DNA appeared elsewhere. Suddenly, the unknown biological profile that had solved Carla's murder represented something larger. It could become a tool for asking whether another victim had been waiting for the same answer. For Carla's family, however, that possibility carried a painful contradiction. They wanted answers, but they did not want another family to discover that their loved one had suffered the same fate. Jim Walker and Cindy Stone had already spent decades wondering why Carla had been targeted. Now they had to consider the possibility that she might not have been the only victim. It was a question without an easy answer, and one that could only be approached through evidence. Speculation could not establish another crime. Rumors could not establish another victim. Only forensic connections, reliable records, and properly investigated cases could do that. And that distinction was essential because the aftermath of a cold case conviction can easily become filled with theories, especially when the convicted person refuses to provide a complete account of his past. McCurley's guilty plea established his responsibility for Carla's murder, but it did not automatically explain everything else that may have happened during his lifetime. His silence became another kind of mystery. A mystery inside the mystery. Investigators had the ability to ask new questions, but they could not force the past to reveal information that had never been preserved. And while the Walker family had finally received justice, they also understood that justice for Carla did not require turning every unanswered question into an accusation. It required evidence. That principle had guided the case from the beginning. It was what separated the original suspicion surrounding McCurley from the later forensic identification. In 1974, detectives had a man with a potentially relevant firearm, but they lacked proof. In 2020, investigators had a genetic genealogy lead, but they still needed direct DNA confirmation. They obtained it. They then confronted McCurley. He confessed the evidence survived legal challenges. He pleaded guilty. He was sentenced to life. Each step mattered because each step converted uncertainty into something more concrete. The process demonstrated why cold cases can take decades to solve, even when investigators have strong suspicions. A suspicion can survive for years. A conviction requires evidence, and evidence has to survive scrutiny. The courts later upheld key rulings involving McCurley's confession, the DNA analysis, and the collection of his DNA from abandoned trash. The Second Court of Appeals ruled in 2022 that his confession was not rendered involuntary by the detective's statements concerning methods of execution, that the analyst's role did not constitute unlicensed forensic DNA analysis, and that McCurley lacked standing to challenge the collection of DNA from his abandoned trash. The legal confirmation mattered because it meant the conviction was not simply the result of a dramatic confession or a sensational forensic breakthrough. The case had been tested through the judicial process. The evidence had been challenged. The courts had considered those challenges, and the conviction remained intact. But there was another irony in the story. The technology that solved Carla's murder was still relatively new. Investigators around the country were only beginning to understand how forensic genetic genealogy could transform cold cases. Carla's case became an example of what could happen when old biological evidence was preserved and later analyzed using modern methods. The DNA profile could not initially identify McCurley through traditional law enforcement databases. Instead, investigators used genealogical information to narrow the possibilities, eventually reaching the McCurley family. That investigative route was crucial because it showed that an unknown offender did not necessarily remain anonymous forever, simply because his DNA was absent from a criminal database. A person could leave no conventional record and still leave a genetic trail through relatives. That trail could eventually lead investigators back to a specific individual. The implications were enormous. Across the United States, families were living with cold cases in which biological evidence had been collected but had never produced an identification. Some of those cases involved murder, others involved sexual assault, unidentified remains, or missing persons. For decades, the evidence could sit untouched because traditional databases offered no match. Genetic genealogy changed the equation. It did not guarantee a solution. It did not eliminate the need for conventional investigation, but it created another pathway. Carla's family understood the significance immediately. After McCurley's conviction, prosecutors and the family discussed the possibility of supporting efforts to use similar technology on other cold cases. The hope was that Carla's story could become more than the story of one crime finally solved. It could become a reason other families might receive the same chance. And yet there remained something deeply personal about Carla that no laboratory could ever capture. She was not simply a DNA profile. She was a 17-year-old girl who had gone to a Valentine's dance. She was a daughter, a sister, a friend, a high school student. She had a boyfriend who expected to see her again. She had parents waiting for her to come home. She had a younger brother who would carry the memory of that night for the rest of his life. The forensic evidence could identify a man, but it could not explain the hole left behind. Her brother Jim eventually described feeling peaceful after McCurley's conviction. His sister Cindy described relief. Those emotions were not celebrations. They were the complicated feelings that come when a family finally receives something it has wanted for decades, but can never truly consider a victory because the person they wanted back cannot return. The courtroom scene after McCurley's guilty plea revealed that complexity in a way no headline could. Members of the Walker family embraced. People cried. McCurley's son Roddy approached Jim Walker, and the two men embraced for several minutes. They were on opposite sides of a tragedy, yet both had been harmed by the same man's action. One family had lost a daughter and sister. The other had discovered that a husband and father had committed a horrific crime decades earlier. The conviction did not erase either reality. McCurley's wife and relatives expressed sorrow to Carla's family, acknowledging that their own family had been devastated by his action. It was one of the strangest and most human moments in a case filled with forensic evidence and courtroom procedure. Two families standing in the same room, connected by a crime that neither family had chosen. And for Jim Walker, there was another painful realization. His parents had died without learning who killed Carla. They had waited for an answer that arrived too late for them to hear it. That fact could never be corrected by DNA. It could never be corrected by a guilty plea. It could never be corrected by a life sentence. The passage of time had already taken that possibility away. This is why the phrase "case solved" can feel incomplete when spoken about a cold case. The investigation can be solved. The legal question can be resolved. The suspect can be identified and convicted, but the consequences remain alive. The family continues to remember. The community continues to carry the story, and the victim remains at the center of it all. Carla's name had survived because people refused to let the case disappear completely. Her friends kept her memory alive. Her family continued speaking about her. Investigators eventually returned to the evidence. Technology opened a door that had remained closed for decades. And once that door opened, the case moved quickly. The arrest came in 2020. The trial began in 2021. The guilty plea came on the third day. McCurley was sentenced to life in prison, but the story did not end there. In 2023, McCurley died of natural causes while serving his sentence less than 3 years after his conviction. His death closed one chapter, but it also made another question more urgent. Would investigators ever discover whether he had been connected to other crimes? Authorities continued examining possible links, and the possibility of additional victims remained an investigative question rather than an established conclusion. Carla's murderer was gone, but the evidence remained, and that was perhaps the final lesson of the case. People disappear. Memories fade. Witnesses die. Investigators retire. Suspects grow old. But evidence can survive. A piece of biological material can remain sealed in an evidence room for decades. A photograph can preserve a face. A statement can preserve a voice. A firearm can remain hidden. A case file can preserve a clue that once seemed insignificant. And one day, a new investigator can open that file and see something the previous generation could not. That is what happened with Carla Walker. Her murder began as a terrifying crime in a Fort Worth parking lot and became one of the city's most haunting cold cases. It remained unresolved through decades of technological change. Then modern DNA analysis and genetic genealogy transformed the investigation. The unknown male profile became a family. The family became a name. The name became a suspect. The suspect became a defendant, and the defendant eventually became a convicted murderer. Yet even after the legal system delivered its answer, Carla's story continued to ask something deeper. How many other cold cases were still waiting for someone to look again? How many families were still staring at old photographs? How many boxes of evidence contained information that investigators had not yet learned how to read? And how many victims were still waiting for their names to be separated from the word unknown? Carla had waited 46 years for her killer to be identified. The science that finally found him could not give her life back, but it could give her family the truth. And sometimes, after decades of silence, the truth is the only thing left that justice can still deliver. The case had been solved, the courtroom had heard the evidence, and Glenn Samuel McCurley had been sentenced to life in prison. But the story of Carla Walker still had one final and deeply unsettling dimension. the possibility that the man identified through her DNA might have carried other secrets with him. For Carla's family, this was not simply an abstract question. Once McCurley had been identified, after 46 years, investigators could finally examine his life through a completely different lens. Every old lead could be reconsidered. Every unexplained detail could be compared against what was now known. Every unsolved crime in the region could potentially be examined for connections. But there was an important line investigators had to maintain. A possibility was not proof. A resemblance was not evidence, and an unanswered case could not simply be attached to McCurley because his name now carried the weight of a conviction. The evidence had to speak for itself, just as it had in Carla's murder. That principle became especially important after McCurley's conviction because authorities acknowledged that they were reviewing other unsolved cases for possible connection. The possibility that he might have been responsible for additional crimes was investigated, but no additional homicide has been publicly established as having been committed by him. His death from natural causes in 2023 ended any possibility of questioning him again in court, leaving investigators dependent on records, evidence, and forensic analysis if they wanted to determine whether other victims might be connected to him. Star-Telegram.com. That uncertainty is difficult to reconcile with the certainty surrounding Carla. In her case, investigators had a biological profile, a genealogical lead, a direct DNA match, statements from McCurley, the recovery of a firearm, and ultimately a guilty plea. The evidence formed a chain strong enough to survive the courtroom. But if there were other victims, investigators would need entirely different chains of evidence for each case, and that is why the possibility of additional crimes remained a question rather than a conclusion. The story also revealed something disturbing about the limitations of memory. Carla's murder occurred in 1974. The people who had been closest to the investigation at the time had spent decades carrying their own memories of the case. Some died before learning the identity of the killer. Others grew old while wondering whether the truth would ever emerge. The detectives who reopened the case were working with evidence collected by another generation. They had to understand the language of old reports, reconsider investigative decisions, and determine which physical evidence remained usable. They had to work through decades of paperwork and uncertainty before they could even reach the DNA breakthrough. And yet, the case demonstrated that old evidence does not necessarily become irrelevant simply because it becomes old. In fact, sometimes age can make evidence more valuable because new technology can extract information that earlier investigators could not see. That was exactly what happened with the biological material connected to Carla. In 1974, investigators could not use DNA to identify the unknown male. Decades later, the same biological evidence produced a genetic profile that became the foundation for the identification. The evidence had not changed. The technology had. That difference is what transformed the case. It also transformed the meaning of the word cold. A cold case is often imagined as a case where every lead has died and every clue has disappeared. But Carla's case showed something different. A case can be cold because the available technology has reached its limit. The evidence can remain alive even when the investigation appears dormant. The moment new technology arrives, the old evidence can suddenly become active again. That is precisely why investigators around the country began revisiting decades-old murders after successful genetic genealogy identifications elsewhere. The science offered a new possibility. Perhaps the answers were already sitting inside evidence rooms, waiting for a method capable of unlocking them. Carla's case became part of that broader forensic revolution. Her murder had not been solved because someone suddenly remembered a forgotten detail. It was solved because investigators combined old evidence with new science. The biological material produced a male DNA profile. Traditional database searches did not produce a match. Genetic genealogy provided a route toward relatives. That route led to the McCurley family. Investigators then collected discarded DNA from Glenn McCurley and compared it with the original profile. The match provided direct evidence. The subsequent interview produced incriminating statements. The firearm recovered from his home added another physical element. The case went to court. and McCurley eventually pleaded guilty. The process was methodical, and that method mattered because it showed how a cold case could move from uncertainty to certainty without relying on a single miraculous clue. It was the accumulation of evidence that changed everything. The DNA alone was powerful, but it was stronger because it existed alongside the other evidence. The genetic genealogy alone identified a family connection, but it was not treated as the final answer. The discarded DNA alone might have raised questions, but it became decisive because it matched the biological evidence from the original investigation. The confession alone might have been challenged, but it was supported by forensic evidence and other investigative findings. Each piece reinforced the others. That is what made the final case so difficult to dismiss, yet the emotional story remained separate from the forensic one. Carla's brother Jim Walker had lived nearly his entire adult life with the knowledge that his sister's killer was still unidentified. When Carla died, Jim was 12 years old. By the time McCurley was arrested, Jim was in his late 50s. He had become a husband, a father, and an adult with decades of memories that did not include the sister who should have grown up beside him. He had watched his parents age and eventually die without learning who had murdered their daughter. That is a particular kind of grief because the family does not simply lose someone once. They lose them again every time an anniversary arrives without an answer. They lose them when another year passes. They lose them when someone asks whether the killer will ever be found. And they lose them when the investigation goes quiet. For 46 years, Carla's family lived with that silence. Then suddenly the silence ended. The arrest in September 2020 was followed by the trial in August 2021. The speed of those events was almost shocking compared with the decades that came before them. The case that had moved slowly for generations suddenly moved rapidly through the criminal justice system. During the trial, the prosecution presented the DNA evidence, the investigative history, the recorded interview, and testimony from people connected to Carla. The defense challenged aspects of the case, but the evidence survived. And then McCurley changed his plea. The trial that could have lasted much longer ended with a guilty plea to capital murder and a sentence of life in prison. Star-telegram.com. That moment created a strange kind of silence in the courtroom. For decades, the family had wanted to hear the words, "We know who did it." Now they had them. But there was no celebration. There was grief. There were tears. There were embraces between people who had never expected to meet under such circumstances. McCurley's son approached Jim Walker, and the two men embraced. The image captured something that the legal language of the case could not express. One man had lost his sister. Another had discovered that his father had committed a crime that had shaped another family's life for almost half a century. Both were carrying consequences created by the same act. The courtroom could determine McCurley's punishment, but it could not determine how the surviving families would live with what they now knew. That burden would continue long after the judge finished speaking. It would continue after the news cameras left. It would continue after McCurley entered prison. And it would continue even after his death. His natural death in prison in 2023 meant that the man responsible for Carla's murder would never be released. But it also meant that investigators could no longer question him directly about any unresolved aspects of his life. Any remaining mystery would have to be answered through evidence. That is why the possibility of additional victims remained unresolved. Investigators could look for patterns, compare DNA profiles, and examine old cases, but they could not simply rely on McCurley's confession to Carla as proof of anything else. Each victim would require her own evidence. Each case would have to stand on its own. That discipline is important because cold cases can generate intense speculation once a suspect is identified. The public naturally wants every mystery connected. But investigators must separate what is known from what is merely possible. In Carla's case, what is known is powerful enough. She was abducted from a bowling alley parking lot in Fort Worth in February 1974. She was found dead 3 days later. Biological evidence recovered from her clothing eventually produced a male DNA profile. Modern forensic genealogy led investigators toward the McCurley family. DNA obtained from Glenn McCurley matched the profile. He was arrested in September 2020. He ultimately pleaded guilty to capital murder in August 2021 and received a life sentence. Those facts alone tell a remarkable story, but they also leave one larger question about the nature of time and justice. Can a crime ever truly be considered forgotten when evidence still exists? Carla's case suggests the answer is no. The public may stop talking about a murder. News coverage may disappear. Detectives may move on. Families may become exhausted from repeating the same story. But if evidence survives, the case is never completely silent. The DNA remained. The photographs remained. The reports remained. The memories remained. And eventually, someone returned to them. That return changed everything. Detective work is often described as finding something new, but cold case work can be about seeing something old differently. The investigators who reopened Carla's case did not discover that she had been murdered. Everyone already knew that. They discovered that the old evidence could now answer a question it had been unable to answer for decades. Who was the man whose DNA was present? That question had been impossible in 1974. In 2020, it became solvable. The difference was not the evidence. The difference was the science. And the lesson extended beyond Carla. Every preserved biological sample represents information that may become more useful as technology improves. A case that seems impossible today may become solvable tomorrow. A DNA profile that fails to match a database today could eventually lead to a relative through a genealogy system. A discarded item could provide the confirmation investigators need. A name that appeared in an old report could suddenly become significant when new science points toward the same family. That is what happened here. The past had not changed. The investigators had. The technology had. The possibilities had. And that was enough to break 46 years of silence. Carla's story, therefore, became more than a murder investigation. It became a demonstration of persistence. Her family had never stopped wanting answers. Investigators eventually returned to the evidence. Scientists developed new methods, and the truth finally emerged from material that had been sitting quietly for decades. But there was one final reality that no forensic breakthrough could change. Carla would never know that her killer had been identified. She would never hear the guilty plea. She would never see her family receive the answer. She remained forever 17, while the man responsible grew old. The cruelest measure of the 46 years was not the number itself. It was everything that happened during those years that Carla never experienced. She never graduated from college. She never began a career. She never grew older. She never celebrated another birthday. She never watched her younger brother become an adult. All of those ordinary possibilities ended on one February night. And yet, despite that, her name survived. It survived in the memories of the people who loved her. It survived in the police files. It survived in the evidence. And eventually it survived in a courtroom where the man responsible admitted guilt. The mystery had ended, but Carla's story had not. Her case became a reminder that justice can move slowly, sometimes painfully slowly, but that evidence can outlast the people who create the mystery around it. 46 years passed before investigators could attach a name to the unknown DNA. 46 years before the family could look toward the person responsible. 46 years before the words guilty and life in prison finally entered the story. And after all that time, the most powerful thing left behind was not the image of the suspect being arrested. It was the image of the evidence that survived him. The DNA waited. The truth waited. Carla's name waited. And when science finally opened the door, the past stepped through. By the time the case had reached its legal conclusion, the most extraordinary transformation had already taken place. A murder that once seemed trapped in 1974 had become a modern forensic investigation, and the evidence collected when Carla Walker was 17 had suddenly become capable of speaking with a clarity that investigators of the past could never have imagined. But solving a cold case is not simply a matter of finding a name. It is the painstaking reconstruction of a chain of events, and every link has to withstand scrutiny. For Carla's family, that reconstruction meant returning to memories they had spent decades trying to survive. For investigators, it meant returning to evidence that had been sitting untouched or underused for years. And for the courts, it meant deciding whether the modern science and the statements obtained decades later were reliable enough to establish guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. The story therefore moved into a new and intensely complicated stage because once McCurley had been identified, the investigation could no longer hide behind uncertainty. Every detail mattered. Every inconsistency mattered. Every old report had to be reconsidered. The original investigators had worked in a world without forensic DNA databases, without genetic genealogy, without the ability to extract and sequence tiny amounts of biological material in the way modern laboratories could. Their tools were interviews, fingerprints, physical objects, witness descriptions, polygraph examinations, and traditional forensic method. They had followed McCurley because of the firearm connection, but they had not been able to establish that he was the killer. Nearly half a century later, the new investigation approached the same man from an entirely different direction. The DNA profile did not begin with his name. It began with an unknown male. That distinction became one of the most important facts in the investigation. The scientists were not told, at the beginning, that they needed to prove McCurley was guilty. They were working from biological evidence associated with Carla's murder. Genetic genealogy then provided information about possible family relationships. The McCurley name emerged. Only afterward did detectives connect that genetic lead with the old case file. It was as if two roads that had been separated for decades suddenly merged at the same intersection. One road came from the original investigation. The other came from modern genetics. Both led toward the same person. That convergence made the case extraordinary, but investigators still needed confirmation. They obtained DNA from McCurley's discarded material, including a drinking straw, and compared it with the unknown male DNA profile. The result was consistent with the profile from Carla's clothing. Investigators then confronted McCurley. He was no longer a young man being questioned in the 1970s. He was 77 years old, facing detectives who had evidence that could not have existed during the original investigation. His physical appearance had changed. His life had changed. The world had changed. But the question had remained the same. What happened to Carla Walker? According to the evidence presented later in court, McCurley eventually admitted that he had killed her. He told detectives that he had strangled Carla and described the events in ways that prosecutors would later use to establish his responsibility. He also directed investigators toward a firearm hidden inside his home. When police searched the residence, they recovered a Ruger .22 from the ceiling. The discovery was striking because of the earlier story McCurley had given investigators in 1974. He had previously claimed that his Ruger had been stolen. Now, decades later, investigators found a Ruger concealed in his home. The firearm alone could not rewrite the past, but alongside the DNA and his statements, it became another piece of the evidentiary puzzle. The case was now moving toward an inevitable confrontation in court. The prosecution had to tell a story that began almost half a century earlier and explain how a teenageress murder had remained unresolved for so long. They had to show the jury why the evidence collected in 1974 remained relevant. They had to explain genetic genealogy, a field unfamiliar to many people, in a way that could be understood without exaggeration. They had to show how the unknown DNA profile led investigators toward a family and how the investigation then narrowed to McCurley. They also had to address the defense challenges to the forensic process. The defense questioned aspects of the DNA analysis and the legal collection of McCurley's discarded DNA. Those challenges were significant because the prosecution could not simply tell the jury that modern technology had solved the case. It had to demonstrate how the technology had been used and why the resulting evidence was reliable. The appellate courts later addressed several of those issues and upheld key rulings supporting the admissibility of the evidence. That meant the forensic pathway remained intact. The DNA could be heard. The confession could be considered. The evidence could be weighed. And Carla's family could finally watch the case move through a process that had been impossible for most of their lives. But before the trial could reach its conclusion, there was another part of the story that had to be reconstructed. Carla herself, because a murder investigation can become so focused on the offender that the victim disappears beneath the evidence. Carla's story demanded the opposite. She had to remain at the center. She was 17. She had gone out with Rodney McCoy. She had attended a Valentine's dance. She was living the ordinary life of a teenager, making plans, spending time with friends, and expecting to return home. The crime shattered that ordinary world in an instant. Her family did not simply lose a daughter and sister, they lost every future moment that should have followed. And because the case remained unsolved, the family was denied another important thing: an explanation. They knew Carla had been murdered. They knew she had been taken, but they did not know who had done it. That absence of knowledge created a permanent wound. When the case reopened, the family had to relive the story once again. Old photographs resurfaced. Old memories became evidence. People who had not spoken about the case in years were asked to remember. The past had to be opened because the past contained the proof. For Jim Walker, that process was especially painful. He had been 12 years old when his sister was killed. The crime had shaped his childhood and followed him into adulthood. His parents had spent the rest of their lives without knowing the killeress' identity. By the time the breakthrough came, they were gone. That meant the answer arrived too late for the people who had spent the most years demanding it. It was one of the cruelest details of the case. Justice had finally arrived, but time had already taken away the chance to share it with everyone who deserved to hear it. When the trial began in August 2021, the courtroom became the place where the old and new versions of the investigation collided. The original evidence was presented beside modern scientific analysis. Witnesses described events from 1974, while forensic experts explained technology developed decades later. The jury was asked to move backward and forward through time, from a parking lot in Fort Worth to a laboratory in Texas, from a teenage girl to a 77-year-old defendant, from a forgotten biological sample to a modern genetic identification. It was a story that could easily have sounded unbelievable if the evidence had not been so carefully connected. The prosecution presented testimony from people who remembered Carla and the night she disappeared. Rodney McCoy described the attack and the moment Carla was taken. His testimony gave the jury a human connection to the crime that scientific evidence alone could never provide. His memory was one of the last direct links to Carla's final moments before her abduction. He had survived the attack, but his life had also been permanently altered by what happened. For decades, he had carried the knowledge that he was the person who had last been with Carla before she was taken. His testimony placed the jury inside the parking lot that night where an ordinary evening suddenly became a crime scene. Then came the forensic evidence. The male DNA profile recovered from Carla's clothing was explained to the juror. The scientists described the work that allowed investigators to use preserved evidence after so many years. The genetic genealogy process was presented as an investigative tool rather than a magical identification system. The family connection led investigators toward McCurley, but the direct DNA comparison provided the confirmation. This distinction was essential. Genetic genealogy had opened the door. Traditional forensic comparison had helped establish what was behind it, and once investigators had that confirmation, they had been able to confront McCurley with evidence that was far more powerful than anything detectives could have shown him in 1974. The interview became another major moment. The jury heard McCurley's own words. They heard the progression from denial toward admission. They heard investigators confront him with the evidence, and eventually they heard him acknowledge responsibility for Carla's death. But even then, the defense challenged the circumstances surrounding the statements. The legal process required the jury to consider not only what McCurley said, but whether the statements had been obtained lawfully and voluntarily. The appellate courts later upheld the relevant rulings, rejecting McCurley's arguments that his confession had been improperly obtained. The legal system had now examined the case from another angle, and the central evidence continued to hold. Then came the firearm. Investigators had recovered a Ruger .22 from McCurley's home after he directed them towards its location. The old firearm clue had returned decades later in a form that was impossible to ignore. In 1974, investigators had known about McCurley's Ruger. In 2020, they found a Ruger hidden in his ceiling. The meaning of that discovery was not determined by one fact alone. It gained significance because of everything surrounding it: the DNA, the confession, the old investigation, the new forensic testing, the history of the weapon. The prosecution could present the jury with a collection of evidence that pointed in the same direction. And then, after the evidence had begun to close around him, McCurley changed his plea. The man who had initially entered a not guilty plea admitted guilt to capital murder. The judge sentenced him to life in prison. After 46 years, the case had reached its legal endpoint. But there was something haunting about the speed of the final stay. 46 years of silence. Then a DNA breakthrough, an arrest, a trial, a guilty plea, a life sentence. It was as though the case had been frozen in time and then suddenly released. Yet for Carle's family, there was no way to experience those events without thinking about everything that had happened while the case remained unsolved. Her parents had died. Friends had grown older. Memories had changed. People who had once been teenagers were now grandparents. The community where Carla had lived had transformed. The physical landscape had changed. But the crime remained fixed. That is what a cold case does. It creates a strange relationship with time. The victim remains in the moment of death while everyone else continues forward. The investigation ages. The family ages. The suspect ages. But the crime itself never becomes old. It remains permanently unfinished until an answer arrives. Carle's case remained unfinished for 46 years. Then modern science completed a connection that investigators had once been unable to make, and that connection had begun with something almost invisible. Biological material left behind on clothing. Something microscopic had survived when memories were fading. That material eventually produced a DNA profile. The profile produced a genealogical lead. The lead produced a surname. The surname pointed investigators back to a man already questioned decades earlier. His DNA confirmed the connection. His statements added another layer. His hidden firearm became another piece. The courtroom confirmed the result. The guilty plea ended the legal uncertainty. And yet, even after all of that, Carla's family still had to live with the one fact that no investigation could change. The answer had come 46 years too late to save her. The justice system had found the killer, but it could not restore the future that had been taken from a 17-year-old girl. It could only name what had happened and hold the person responsible. And perhaps that is why Carla Walker's case continues to resonate so deeply. It is not merely a story about a killer who was finally caught. It is a story about evidence refusing to disappear. It is a story about investigators returning to a case that seemed exhausting. It is a story about technology reaching backward through time. And it is a story about a family that refused to let Carla become just another forgotten name in an old police file. The years had changed everything except the truth. The truth had been waiting quietly, preserved in evidence, waiting for someone to know how to read it. And when investigators finally did, 46 years of silence began to break. The case had reached its legal conclusion, but for those who had lived with Carla Walker's murder for nearly half a century, a guilty plea could never be the same thing as closure, because closure suggests an end, while grief does not obey court schedules, prison sentences, or the words spoken by a judge. And for Carla's family, the moment Glenn Samuel McCurley admitted guilt was not the end of the story, but the moment when decades of unanswered questions suddenly became painfully real, because for 46 years they had been forced to imagine what might have happened. Who could have done it? Why Carla had been chosen, and whether the person responsible was still somewhere nearby, living an ordinary life while her family carried an extraordinary loss. And now they finally knew. And knowing was both a relief and another wound, because the man they had searched for was not a mysterious stranger who had vanished into another state or another country, but someone whose name had appeared in the original investigation, someone who had been questioned decades earlier, someone whose connection to a Ruger .22 had been recorded, someone who had remained in the community while the Walker family continued aging without an answer, and that realization forced investigators and family members alike to look backward once again, not simply at the night Carla died, but at everything that had happened afterward, because a cold case does not exist in isolation. It exists inside years of birthdays, anniversaries, marriages, funerals, careers, children, grandchildren, and ordinary moments that continue while one family remains emotionally anchored to the worst night of its life. And for Carla's brother Jim, that night had begun when he was only 12 years old, an age when a child should be thinking about school, friends, sport, and the future, not trying to understand why his sister had disappeared and why his parents were suddenly living inside a nightmare that had no explanation. And as Jim grew older, Carla remained 17 in his memory, forever fixed at the age when her life was taken, while he moved through adolescence into adulthood, watched his parents grow older, built his own life, and carried a question that had no answer. And the cruelest part was that his parents never lived long enough to hear the answer themselves, because they died while Carla's killer remained unidentified, meaning that when the breakthrough finally came in 2020, the people who had spent decades waiting for justice were no longer there to receive it. And that is one of the most painful realities of long, cold cases, because justice can arrive after the people who wanted it most have already disappeared, leaving their children to receive an answer on their behalf. And when detectives returned to Carla's case, they were not simply reopening a file. They were reopening a family wound that had never fully closed, and every new forensic test carried the possibility of either disappointment or revelation, because investigators had no guarantee that the biological evidence would produce a usable profile after so many years, no guarantee that the profile would identify anyone, and no guarantee that a genealogical investigation would lead anywhere meaningful. But the evidence survived, and modern technology transformed it, and the unknown male profile became the starting point for an investigation that would eventually circle back to the same family name recorded in the original case, McCurley, and that coincidence was so extraordinary that it could have seemed almost impossible if the forensic process had not independently supported it, because the investigators were not simply choosing McCurley from an old list of suspects and then searching for evidence to support their theory. They were following a genetic trail, and that trail led toward a family already known to investigators, creating a convergence between past suspicion and modern science. And yet even then, detectives had to proceed carefully, because the law does not convict people simply because their names appear in a genealogy investigation, and a family connection is not the same thing as direct evidence, which meant that investigators needed a sample from McCurley himself. And they obtained one from discarded material, eventually producing the DNA comparison that transformed the genealogical, led into direct forensic evidence, and that moment represented one of the most remarkable transitions in the entire investigation, because an unknown male profile had become a specific person, and the specific person was not simply someone selected by chance. He was a man whose history was already woven into the original case, and then investigators confronted him. And the conversation that followed became another bridge between 1974 and 2020, because McCurley was now an elderly man being questioned about something that had happened when he was young, and detectives were asking him to account for a crime that had haunted a family for almost half a century. And according to evidence later presented in court, his answers eventually changed, and he admitted responsibility for Carla's murder, providing investigators with statements that prosecutors would later use against him. But the interview did not simply produce an admission. It also led investigators toward another physical clue, because McCurley told detectives where a firearm was hidden inside his home. And when they searched the property, they found a Ruger .22 concealed in the ceiling, and suddenly the weapon that had existed as an unresolved piece of the 1974 investigation was connected to the modern investigation in a way that was difficult to ignore, because decades earlier McCurley had told investigators his Ruger had been stolen, while decades later a Ruger was recovered from his home. And although the meaning of that firearm had to be evaluated within the totality of the evidence, its presence became another striking detail in a case already filled with improbable connections. And for investigators, every one of those connections mattered, because they were rebuilding a case that had once been considered unsolvable, and they knew that time itself would be used by the defense to challenge the prosecution, because the older a case becomes, the more difficult it can be to establish what happened with certainty. Witnesses die, memories fade, records disappear, evidence deteriorates, and people who once knew important details may no longer remember them accurately, but biological evidence can sometimes resist those problems. And that was precisely what happened here, because DNA does not depend on a witness remembering what they saw 46 years earlier. It does not require a detective to remember every detail of an interview, and it does not become less genetically distinctive because the calendar advanced, and that made the preserved biological evidence extraordinarily important because it provided a scientific connection between the crime and the suspect that could be examined using modern standards, and the defense challenged aspects of the forensic process, including questions surrounding the DNA analysis. The collection of Mercurius discarded DNA, but the legal process ultimately allowed the evidence to remain part of the case, and that meant the prosecution could present the jury with a combination of old evidence and new technology, and the courtroom itself became a kind of bridge through time because witnesses were talking about 1974 while scientists were explaining 21st century genetic techniques, and McCurley was sitting before the court as a 77-year-old man, while Carla remained 17 in every photograph shown to the jury, and that contrast could not have been more brutal because everyone else had aged except the victim, and the jury was being asked to understand that the young woman at the center of the case had been permanently separated from the passage of time, and perhaps nowhere was that more powerful than when Rodney McCoy testified, because he was one of the last people to see Carla alive, and his memories brought the parking lot back into the courtroom, bringing with them the sudden violence, the gun, the attack, and the terrifying moment when Carla was taken from him, and those memories had remained with McCoy for decades, long after the physical location had changed and the world had moved on, because surviving a violent attack does not mean leaving it behind, and the testimony reminded everyone that Carla had not simply vanished from a page. She had been alive moments before her abduction, speaking, trying to understand what was happening, and then she was gone. And 3 days later, the search for her ended with the discovery of her body, transforming a missing person investigation into a murder investigation, and the community was left with fear and questions, while detectives faced the enormous task of finding a killer who had created distance between himself and the crime. And that distance lasted for decades, but the evidence never stopped existing, and eventually investigators were able to cross that distance, first through DNA, then through genealogy, then through direct comparison, and finally through McCurley's own statements. And by the time the case reached trial, the story had become almost impossible to separate into old evidence and new evidence, because they were now part of one continuous chain. And when McCurley changed his plea to guilty, that chain finally reached its legal endpoint. But for Carla's family, another question remained. Perhaps the most painful question of all, which was not who killed her, because that was finally known, but why had it taken so long? And there was no single answer, because the investigation had been conducted in a different technological era, and the evidence that ultimately solved the case could not be interpreted in the same way in 1974, and investigators at the time had followed the leads available to them, including McCurley's connection to the Ruger. But without modern DNA technology, they could not make the decisive connection, and that reality should not be reduced to a simple story of investigators missing an obvious suspect, because solving a murder requires evidence that can withstand legal scrutiny, and suspicion alone is never enough. And what the later investigation demonstrated was that a person could remain outside the reach of the justice system, not necessarily because investigators had never considered him, but because the technology needed to prove the connection had not yet arrived. And when it did arrive, the case moved with extraordinary speed. And that may be the most haunting lesson Carla's story leaves behind, because the truth was not created in 2020. It had existed since 1974, buried in evidence, preserved in memories, recorded in reports, and carried silently by the people who knew Carla, and modern science simply gave investigators the ability to uncover it, and once the truth emerged, there was no way to put it back into silence because a DNA profile had identified the man, a comparison had confirmed the connection, an interview had produced incriminating statements, a firearm had been recovered, and a courtroom had heard the evidence, and the case that had once seemed destined to remain unsolved was now part of legal history. But the emotional consequences continued long after the verdict, because Carla's family still had to live with her absence, still had to look at photographs of a girl who would never age, still had to remember a voice that had been silenced when she was 17, and still had to accept that the answer they had wanted for decades had arrived only after almost an entire lifetime had passed. And perhaps that is why the final image of the case is not the arrest, not the DNA laboratory, not the courtroom, and not the prison sentence, but the quiet persistence of Carla's name. Because the killer eventually grew old, the investigation eventually reached its conclusion, and the technology eventually changed. But Carla remained at the center of the story, and 46 years after her murder, the world finally learned who had been responsible, proving that a cold case can become silent without ever becoming empty, because sometimes the evidence is still there, waiting in the dark, waiting for science to catch up, waiting for investigators to look again, and waiting for the truth to finally become impossible to ignore. The courtroom had given Carla Walker-West's family the answer they had waited 46 years to hear. But outside that courtroom, the world continued moving, and the case began to take on a different meaning, because once a cold case is solved, people often imagine that the story is finished, that the mystery has been closed, the suspect identified, the sentence imposed, and everyone involved can finally walk away. But for families like Carla S., there is no walking away. There is only learning how to live with an answer that came decades too late. And in Carla S.'s case, the answer carried an especially painful weight because her killer had not been discovered by some sudden confession from a stranger or by a dramatic eyewitness emerging after years of silence, but through evidence that had been waiting inside the original investigation almost since the night she was taken. Evidence that had survived the passage of time until investigators finally possessed the technology needed to interpret it, and that transformation changed the meaning of everything that had come before, because the old case was no longer simply a story of failure. It became a story of persistence, preservation, and the strange ability of forensic science to reach backward through decades. And one of the most important pieces of that story was the DNA recovered from Carla's clothing, because biological evidence can appear insignificant when first collected, especially in an era when investigators do not yet possess the technology to fully analyze it, but the evidence can remain valuable long after. The methods used to examine it have become obsolete. And that was the situation investigators faced when they returned to Carla's case, because they were not starting from zero. They were starting from material connected to a crime seen nearly half a century old, and the challenge was to determine whether modern testing could extract information from that material. And when a male DNA profile was developed, the investigation suddenly had something it had never possessed before: an objective biological signature connected to the crime. But there was still no name, no address, no photograph, and no obvious suspect, because the profile did not match a person in the traditional law enforcement databases, and that could easily have become another dead end. Another moment when investigators knew they had evidence but could not identify the person who left it behind. But genetic genealogy offered another path, and instead of asking the database to produce an exact match, investigators could examine genetic relationships and use those relationships to identify possible family lines. And the process eventually led toward the McCurley family. And when investigators recognized the surname, the significance was immediate, because Glenn Samuel McCurley had already appeared in the original investigation decades earlier, and that convergence was one of the most remarkable elements of the entire case, because a modern scientific process had independently pointed investigators toward a family name already present in the historical file, and suddenly a question from 1974 was being asked again in 2020. But this time, investigators had tools that the original detectives could never have imagined, and they still did not rush, because identifying a family was not enough. And even identifying a likely individual through genealogical research was not enough, because the legal standard required direct evidence, and so investigators obtained DNA from McCurley's discarded material and compared it with the unknown male profile developed from evidence connected to Carla, and the comparison supported the identification, transforming the genealogical, led into a direct forensic connection. And that was the moment when the investigation stopped being a search through possibilities and became a focused case against one individual. But the detectives still had to confront him, and when they did, McCurley was an elderly man, 77 years old, separated from the crime by almost his entire adult life, and according to evidence later presented in court, he initially denied killing Carla, but detectives continued questioning him and confronted him with the DNA evidence, and eventually he admitted responsibility, telling investigators that he had strangled Carla, and he also provided information about the location of a firearm, leading investigators to a Ruger point to two hidden in the ceiling of his home, and that discovery revived one of the oldest clues in the case, because in 1974, investigators had already been interested in McCurley because of his ownership of a Ruger 22. And he had told them that his firearm had been stolen. But now, decades later, investigators found a Ruger hidden inside his home, creating another connection between the original investigation and the modern one. And although every piece of evidence had to be evaluated separately, the combined picture was extraordinary because the old firearm clue, the modern DNA identification, the genetic genealogy, the discarded DNA, and McCurley-S' own statements were all converging on the same person, and for Carly-S' family, the realization must have been almost impossible to process because for decades the identity of the killer had been an absence, a blank space in the middle of their lives, and suddenly that blank space had a face, a name, and a voice. And the family had to confront the fact that the person responsible had been living an ordinary life while they continued carrying the consequences of what had happened. And that reality is one of the most difficult aspects of long unsolved crimes because the victim's family experiences time differently from the person responsible, and Carla's family spent years remembering a 17-year-old girl while McCurley continued aging, eventually becoming an old man. And when investigators finally caught up with him, the contrast was devastating because the victim had remained frozen at 17 while the suspect had lived through decades that Carla would never experience, and the courtroom later made that contrast impossible to ignore because photographs of Carla showed the teenager she had been while the defendant sat before the court as a 77-year-old man, and the passage of time was visible in a single room, one person permanently young, the other carrying nearly half a century of life after the crime, and perhaps that was why the testimony of Rodney McCoy was so powerful, because he connected the jury to Carla as a living person rather than simply a victim in an old murder file, and McCoy had been with Carla shortly before her abduction, and his memory of the attack had survived for decades, allowing him to describe the sudden violence that transformed an ordinary evening into a nightmare, and his testimony reminded the courtroom that Carla had a voice, relationships, plans, and a future that was destroyed in a matter of minutes. And when the prosecution presented the DNA evidence, it was not merely presenting a scientific result, it was presenting evidence tied to that human story, biological material that had survived from the same crime that had taken Carla's life, and the jury was asked to consider that evidence alongside the testimony, the investigative history, the firearm, and McCurley's statements, and then came the legal challenges, because the defense questioned the methods used in the DNA investigation and the circumstances surrounding the collection of McCurley's discarded DNA, and those challenges were important because forensic science must operate within the boundaries of law, and the prosecution could not simply rely on the emotional power of the case. It had to establish that the evidence had been properly obtained and reliably analyzed, and the courts ultimately rejected key defense arguments, allowing the evidence to remain part of the prosecution's case, and by the time the trial reached its decisive moment, the decades-old investigation had become something entirely different from the case detectives had faced in 1974, because the prosecution now had scientific evidence that could connect McCurley to Carla, statements from McCurley himself, and the physical evidence recovered from his home. And on the third day of the trial, McCurley changed his plea and pleaded guilty to capital murder, receiving a life sentence. And for Carla's family, the words guilty and life in prison finally provided the legal recognition that had been missing for most of their lives. But there was no possibility of restoring what had been lost. And that is the painful paradox of every cold case solved after decades, because justice can establish responsibility but cannot reverse history. And the family could finally know the name of the man responsible, but could never know what Carla might have become. And her brother Jim could never grow older alongside his sister. could never introduce her to the people who entered his life later, could never see her become an adult, and his parents could never hear the confession they had wanted to hear because they died before the breakthrough. And that detail became one of the most heartbreaking consequences of the 46-year delay because the answer arrived, but it arrived after time had already taken away some of the people who deserved to receive it. And yet the investigation also created something important for future cold cases because Carla's murder demonstrated the power of combining preserved evidence with modern technology, and the case showed how genetic genealogy could transform an unknown DNA profile into an investigative list, while traditional forensic comparison could then provide direct confirmation. And the lesson was not that every cold case would suddenly be solved, because genetic genealogy cannot guarantee an identification, and not every crime leaves usable biological evidence, but Carla's case demonstrated what becomes possible when evidence survives long enough for science to catch up. And that possibility extends far beyond one family, because across the country there are families who have spent decades waiting for answers, families who have photographs of loved ones but no explanation for how they died, families who have police reports but no suspect, families who have attended anniversaries without knowing whether the person responsible was still alive, and every preserved piece of evidence offers a small possibility that the silence may eventually be broken. And Carla's case became a powerful reminder that time does not necessarily destroy every clue. Sometimes it only delays the moment when the clue can be understood. And the biological evidence connected to Carla had waited through decades of scientific progress, through changes in police departments, through retirements and deaths, through generations growing up, and through the transformation of forensic science. And when investigators finally examined it with modern tools, the evidence pointed toward a man whose name had once been written in the original case file, and the circle closed, not because someone suddenly discovered an entirely new suspect, but because old information and new science finally met. And perhaps that is the most remarkable part of Carla's story, the realization that the answer had not necessarily been absent all those years. It had been inaccessible, hidden inside evidence that nobody could fully interpret. And once the technology changed, the evidence became a voice, and that voice pointed investigators toward the truth. And although the legal case was resolved, questions about the full extent of McCurlias' actions remained a separate matter, with investigators examining whether there might be connections to other unsolved crimes, but without publicly establishing additional murder. And that distinction matters because Carla's case was solved through evidence, not speculation, and every other potential case would require its own proof, its own investigation, and its own answer. And Carla's family understood better than almost anyone that an answer matters because an unanswered crime becomes a permanent shadow over everyone who survives it. And for 46 years, Carla's family lived beneath that shadow. But eventually, the shadow lifted enough for them to see the truth clearly. And even though the truth was painful, it was no longer uncertain, and that difference changed everything. Because there is a particular kind of suffering in not knowing, a constant cycle of questions that can never be settled. And once the truth arrives, the pain may remain, but the uncertainty is gone. And for Carla, her name was no longer attached to an unsolved murder. Her case was no longer simply a cold file, and her killer was no longer an unknown man, because modern science had given investigators the missing link, and the courtroom had confirmed it. And after nearly half a century, the silence surrounding Carla Walker finally had an answer. The guilty plea had closed the courtroom chapter, but it could not close the investigation that had been growing around Glenn McCurlias' name, because once investigators knew who had killed Carla Walker, another question became impossible to ignore. Was Carla the only young woman whose life had crossed his path? The question was never answered with certainty, and that distinction matters because McCurley was convicted only of Carla's murder. But detectives did examine other unsolved killings for possible connection, and some of those cases carried details that were disturbing enough to demand a second look. In the years after McCurlias' conviction, investigators acknowledged that they were examining whether he could be connected to other unsolved homicides in the Fort Worth area. His death in prison in July 2023 ended any possibility of confronting him with those questions again. He died of natural causes while serving a life sentence without parole. But before his death, the questions had already begun. Carle's siblings wanted him to speak. They wanted to know whether there were other families living through the same nightmare. During the sentencing, Carle's sister Cindy Stone directly urged McCurley to confess if he had harmed anyone else. Her words reflected a fear that had begun to grow once investigators understood the circumstances of Carle's killing. The attack had apparently been carried out by a stranger. The victim was 17. McCurley had approached Carla and Rodney McCoy at a parked car outside a bowling alley. He had used a firearm to overpower McCoy and take Carla. Carla was later found strangled. Experts interviewed after the conviction said aspects of the crime could be consistent with a repeat offender. But they also emphasized that there was no conclusive evidence proving McCurley had killed anyone else. That distinction became essential. The temptation in a case like this is to connect every nearby unsolved murder to the newly identified offender. But investigators could not afford to let suspicion become fact. Carle's case had been solved because evidence connected McCurley to the crime. Any other case would require its own evidence, its own forensic trail, its own investigation. And that is where the story became darker, because Fort Worth had other unsolved murders from the same era, including cases involving women who had been abducted or strangled. One of the names investigators considered was Becky Martin, a Tarrant County Junior College student who was abducted on February 7, 1973, roughly a year before Carla disappeared. Her skeletal remains were later found in a culvert in West Fort Worth. Another was June Ward, 25, whose body was found in February 1977 after she had been strangled. Her vehicle was located elsewhere, and her death remained unsolved. The similarities were unsettling, but similarities were not proof. Investigators could see patterns. They could ask questions. They could test evidence. But until a forensic connection existed, the cases remained separate. And that was perhaps the most responsible way to approach the possibility, because Carle's family understood better than anyone what it meant to lie for decades without answers. They did not want another family to be given false hope. They wanted evidence. They wanted certainty. They wanted the same thing that had finally been given to them, a name supported by science and a conviction supported by the courts. That demand for evidence also revealed why the original investigation had taken so long. In 1974, detectives did not have the tools available decades later. The case began with physical clues and witness statements. A magazine from a Ruger pistol was recovered from the bowling alley parking lot. Investigators identified McCurley as one of the people in the Fort Worth area who owned a similar weapon. When questioned, he said his pistol had been stolen before Carla's murder. He was given a polygraph and was not arrested. The case eventually went cold. Decades later, investigators learned that McCurley had actually purchased another magazine for the pistol after the murder, a detail that added complexity to the old investigation. The significance of that old evidence became clearer only after the modern investigation identified McCurley through DNA. Suddenly, the old reports could be read differently. The old interviews could be reconsidered. The firearm could be re-examined in context. The original investigators had been working without the biological identification that would eventually become decisive. Their investigation had followed hundreds of leads, but none produced enough evidence to establish guilt. The case went silent, yet silence was not the same thing as disappearance. The evidence remained in police files and evidence rooms, and decades later, detectives Leah Wagner and Jeff Bennett reopened the case. Their work eventually led to advanced DNA testing of evidence recovered from Carle's clothing. A male DNA profile emerged. Traditional databases did not identify the source. Genetic genealogy then offered a new investigative route. The technique did not simply search for an exact offender match. It used genetic relationships to help trace a family line. That process eventually brought investigators back to the McCurley family, and that was the moment the old case began to collide with modern science. McCurley's name was no longer merely an old, lead-in-a-forgotten report. It was now being reached through independent genetic evidence, but investigators still needed direct confirmation, and that confirmation came from DNA obtained from McCurley's discarded material. The resulting comparison matched the male DNA profile associated with Carle's case. The investigation had finally crossed the gap that had separated suspicion from proof. Then came the interview. McCurley was 77 when detectives confronted him. He was no longer the 31-year-old man who had been questioned in 1974. He had spent decades living a life that appeared ordinary from the outside. He had family. He had children. He had grown old. Yet the detectives were asking him about a 17-year-old girl whose family had spent almost half a century waiting for an explanation. During the recorded interview, investigators confronted him with the DNA evidence. According to the evidence later presented in court, McCurley eventually admitted responsibility. He acknowledged killing Carla and described strangling her. He told investigators that he had been afraid she would tell someone what had happened. The recorded interview became one of the most powerful pieces of evidence in the case because it placed McCurley's own words alongside the scientific evidence. But the confession was not the only thing investigators recovered. McCurley also directed police toward a firearm hidden inside his home. Investigators searched the property and recovered a Ruger .22 concealed in the ceiling. The discovery was striking because of the firearm history from 1974. The original investigation had already focused on McCurley because of a Ruger. He had told investigators that his weapon had been stolen. Now, nearly half a century later, a Ruger was found hidden inside his home. The old clue had returned in a completely different context. The physical evidence did not stand alone, but it became another link in a chain that now included DNA, genealogy, the recorded interview, and the recovered firearm. When the trial began in August 2021, prosecutors presented that chain to the court. McCurley initially pleaded not guilty. For 2 days, testimony and evidence were presented. Rodney McCoy described the night Carla was taken. His testimony placed the jury inside the parking lot where the attack began. He described the sudden opening of the car door, the assault, and Carla being dragged away. He remembered her looking back toward him and telling him to get her father. Those words had remained with him for decades. They became one of the most painful pieces of testimony in the courtroom because they were the last known words Carla spoke to him before she disappeared. The prosecution then presented the forensic evidence showing how investigators had used modern technology to reach back into a case that had been dormant since 1974. The defense challenged aspects of the DNA evidence and the circumstances surrounding the collection of McCurley's DNA from discarded material. Those challenges eventually reached the appellate courts, but the courts affirmed the trial court's rulings. The conviction remained intact. Then, on the third day, the atmosphere changed. McCurley changed his plea. He pleaded guilty to capital murder. Judge Elizabeth Beach sentenced him to life in prison without the possibility